When tech billionaire Ariel Blake's vintage convertible breaks down on a lonely country road, she makes a joke that changes everything. Frustrated by endless failed repair attempts, she live streams to her followers. "I'll marry any man who can fix this car." The video goes viral instantly. Ariel laughs it off, certain no one will take her seriously. But in the small town of Cedar Creek, widowed mechanic Jack Nolan doesn't know about viral videos or billion-dollar heiresses. He simply sees a stranded motorist and stops to help. With his 8-year-old son Max watching, Jack has the temperamental engine running in minutes, then quietly refuses payment. This simple act of kindness from a man who treats her like a person, not a headline, touches something deep within Ariel's guarded heart. What Jack doesn't realize is that his genuine compassion has just set in motion a chain of events that will challenge everything both of them thought they knew about love, family, and second chances. Can a small-town mechanic with a big heart really capture the affection of a woman who has everything money can buy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills as Ariel Blake stood in her marble-floored kitchen, coffee cup in hand, staring out at a world that felt as distant as the stars. At 34, she possessed everything the magazines said should make her happy: a tech empire worth $3 billion, a mansion that graced Architectural Digest covers, and enough designer clothes to outfit a small country. Yet the silence that filled her 12,000-square-foot home felt heavier than the California smog. The vintage Ferrari 275 GTB gleamed in her 6-car garage, its deep blue paint reflecting the morning light like a sapphire. Her father had given it to her on her 21st birthday, back when his eyes still sparkled with the dreams that built Blake Technologies from a garage startup into a Silicon Valley giant. "This car," he'd said, running his weathered hands along the smooth curves, "represents everything I want you to remember about craftsmanship, about building something that lasts." Now, 13 years later, it was one of the few things that still connected her to the man who'd taught her that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. Her phone buzzed with the familiar chorus of business notifications. Board meetings, acquisition proposals, quarterly projections, the endless machinery of wealth that demanded constant attention. Ariel's assistant had already scheduled her day down to the minute. 9 a.m. with the marketing team, 10:30 with legal, lunch with potential investors. The same routine that had governed her life for the past 5 years, ever since she'd taken full control of the company after her father's sudden heart attack. She scrolled through her social media feeds, where millions of followers hung on her every carefully curated post. Professional photos of her at charity galas, inspirational quotes about female entrepreneurship, glimpses of her luxurious lifestyle that made her seem approachable while maintaining just enough distance to preserve the mystique. It was all performance, she knew, but it served its purpose. The lonelier she felt, the more followers she gained. 300 miles north, in the small town of Cedar Creek, Jack Nolan was already 2 hours into his workday. The morning air still carried the crisp bite of autumn, and the mountains that ringed the valley wore their first dusting of snow like a promise of winter's approach. His garage sat on the corner of Main and Elm, a modest brick building that had housed Nolan's auto repair for 3 generations. The sign out front, hand-painted by his grandfather in 1952, had faded to the color of old denim, but the reputation it represented remained solid as the mountains themselves. Jack's hands, stained with honest grease and marked by small scars from years of working with metal and machinery, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that every bolt, every gasket, every carefully calibrated adjustment mattered. At 36, he possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he could do. The 1998 Chevy pickup he was working on wasn't glamorous, but it would run reliably for another 100,000 miles when he finished with it. That meant something in a world increasingly obsessed with the new and disposable. "Dad, you promised you'd help me with my volcano today," came a voice from the office doorway. Max Nolan, 8 years old and blessed with his father's steady gaze and his mother's quick smile, stood holding a cardboard box that contained the materials for his science fair project. His dark hair stuck up in the back where he'd slept on it wrong, and his Spider-Man t-shirt bore the evidence of breakfast. Jack wiped his hands on an old rag and smiled. "I did promise, didn't I? Let me just finish tightening these bolts, and we'll set up your volcano right here in the shop." Max beamed and set the box on the workbench with the careful reverence of a child who'd been taught to respect both tools and dreams. Inside were papier-mâché components, red food coloring, baking soda, and everything needed to create a small miracle that would erupt on command. "Henderson says, if I explain it really well, I might win first place." "Win or lose, I'm proud of you for trying," Jack said, meaning every word. He'd learned, in the 3 years since Sarah's death, that these small moments of shared purpose were what held life together. The big gestures, the grand declarations, those were for movies. Real love lived in the daily choice to show up, to pay attention, to make space for someone else's dreams alongside your own. The bell above the shop door chimed, and old Pete Morrison shuffled in, his arthritic hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee. At 73, Pete had been coming to Nolan's garage since Jack's father ran the place, and he'd appointed himself the unofficial morning commentator on everything from weather to politics to the moral fiber of the younger generation. "Morning, Jack. Morning, Max." Pete settled onto his usual stool near the coffee pot that Jack kept brewing for customers who wanted to chat while they waited. "Saw on the news they're predicting early snow this year. Course, they've been predicting that for the past 20 years, so I wouldn't hang your hat on it." Jack grinned and poured Pete a fresh cup. "Maybe this'll be the year they get it right." "Maybe pigs'll fly," Pete replied, but his eyes were twinkling. "What's the boy building there?" Max looked up from carefully arranging his volcano components. "It's for the science fair, Mr. Pete. It's going to erupt and everything. Dad says the chemical reaction between the baking soda and vinegar creates carbon dioxide gas, and the pressure has to go somewhere, so it comes out the top like a real volcano." "Well, I'll be. In my day, we just mixed things up to see what would happen. Now they got fancy names for everything." Pete sipped his coffee and nodded approvingly. "Your dad always was good at explaining how things work. Gets it from his grandfather. That man could make a broken lawnmower sing opera." Jack felt the familiar warmth that came from being part of something larger than himself. This garage, this town, these relationships that had been built slowly over decades, they formed the foundation of a life that made sense. He'd never been rich, might never be, but he was wealthy in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. His phone, a practical device that made calls and sent texts without fanfare, buzzed with a reminder about Max's parent-teacher conference next week. Jack made a mental note to close the shop early that day. These were the appointments that mattered, the responsibilities that gave shape to his days. Meanwhile, in Beverly Hills, Ariel sat in her Tesla, stuck in traffic on the 405, scrolling through acquisition reports that would determine the fate of a smaller tech company and its 300 employees. The numbers were clear. Buying them out would eliminate competition and increase Blake Technologies' market share by 12%. The human cost was equally clear. Most of those employees would be redundant within 6 months. She approved the acquisition with a few taps on her tablet, then immediately felt the familiar hollow sensation that followed such decisions. When had she become the kind of person who could casually eliminate jobs with the same emotional investment she'd put into choosing her lunch? Her father would have agonized over those 300 families, would have found a way to integrate rather than eliminate, to build rather than destroy. Her phone rang, and she saw her publicist's name on the screen. "Ariel, darling, I have the most wonderful opportunity." That new streaming platform wants to do a documentary about female tech leaders. Think of the exposure, the brand-building potential. "I'll think about it," Ariel said, which they both knew meant no. She was tired of being a brand, tired of having her life packaged and sold to audiences who saw her as entertainment rather than a person. Back in Cedar Creek, Jack was helping Max mix the papier-mâché paste when the boy asked, "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of my volcano?" Jack's hands stilled for a moment. Sarah had been gone for 3 years, but Max still asked these questions, still needed to know that his mother's love remained present, even in her absence. "I think she'd be amazed by how smart and creative you are," Jack said carefully. "She'd probably want to make it erupt about 10 times just to see the look on your face." Max giggled, the sound bright and clear in the morning air. "She'd probably get the volcano stuff all over her hands like she did when she helped me with my art projects." "She would," Jack agreed, remembering how Sarah had approached everything with the same enthusiastic mess, making that had made her such a wonderful mother and wife. "She'd probably forget to put on an apron and get it all over her favorite shirt. And then she'd laugh about it," Max added, his small hands shaping the volcano with careful precision. "And then she'd laugh about it," Jack confirmed. These conversations were part of their routine now, a way of keeping Sarah's memory alive without letting it become a weight that prevented them from moving forward. Jack had learned that grief wasn't something you got over, it was something you carried, something that changed shape over time but never fully disappeared. What mattered was making sure it didn't prevent Max from believing in the possibility of joy. The morning passed peacefully, with Jack splitting his attention between engine repairs and volcano construction, Pete providing commentary on both activities, and Max asking the kinds of questions that reminded Jack why he'd chosen this life. When the school bus arrived to take Max to his afternoon classes, the boy hugged his father tightly and whispered, "Thanks for helping me, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, son. Have a good day." As the bus pulled away, Jack returned to his work, but his mind wandered to the conversation with Max about Sarah. It had been 3 years since cancer had taken his wife. 3 years since he'd made the choice to stay in Cedar Creek and raise their son in the place where they'd all been happy. He'd had offers to work for larger companies, opportunities that would have meant more money and maybe more recognition, but they would have required leaving behind the life he and Sarah had built together. Sometimes, late at night when Max was sleeping and the house felt too quiet, Jack wondered if he was holding on too tightly to the past. Sarah had been gone long enough that the sharp edges of grief had worn smooth, replaced by something gentler but no less permanent. He still wore his wedding ring, still thought of himself as Sarah's husband first, and everything else second. But lately, he'd begun to notice the way his chest tightened when he saw couples walking hand in hand downtown, the way he felt when he watched Max interact with his friends' mothers at school events. He wasn't ready to move on, might never be ready, but he was beginning to understand that moving forward didn't necessarily mean leaving Sarah behind. It might mean finding a way to honor what they'd had while remaining open to what might yet be possible. In Beverly Hills, Ariel was finishing her day with a video call to her investors, discussing the quarterly projections that would determine bonuses and stock prices and the general trajectory of her empire. The numbers were good, better than good, actually, but the satisfaction she'd once felt from such success had faded to something mechanical and hollow. After the call ended, she walked through her empty house, past rooms that were perfectly decorated and completely unused. The dining room table that seated 12 but had never hosted a dinner party. The library filled with books she'd never read, chosen by an interior designer for their aesthetic value rather than their content. The guest bedrooms that had never welcomed guests. She paused in the doorway of what had once been her father's office, now converted into a space she rarely entered. His desk remained exactly as he'd left it, covered with sketches and prototypes, and the kind of passionate chaos that came from someone who loved the process of creation more than the product itself. A photo of the two of them stood on the corner of the desk. Ariel at 16, grinning beside the Ferrari on the day they'd first taken it for a drive. Her father had been a dreamer, a man who'd believed that technology could make the world better and that success meant nothing if it wasn't shared. He'd built Blake Technologies not just to make money, but to solve problems, to create things that mattered. Somewhere along the way, Ariel had lost sight of that vision, had let the company become about market dominance rather than innovation, about profit rather than purpose. She picked up the photo and studied her younger self's face, remembering the girl who'd believed she could change the world. That girl had been passionate, optimistic, unafraid to take risks for the right reasons. When had she become someone who played it safe, who made decisions based on quarterly reports rather than conviction? The Ferrari keys hung on a hook by the garage door, untouched for weeks. Tomorrow, she decided, she would take the car for a drive. Not to a business meeting or a charity event, but simply to remember what it felt like, to go somewhere without a destination, to feel the wind in her hair and the sun on her face and the pure joy of motion for its own sake. It was a small decision, barely worth noting in the grand scheme of her carefully orchestrated life. But sometimes, the smallest choices are the ones that change everything. The Ferrari's engine made a sound that Ariel had never heard before, a grinding metallic protest that seemed to echo her own frustration with the day. She'd left Beverly Hills on impulse that Tuesday morning, driving north on Highway 101, with no particular destination in mind, just the need to escape the suffocating predictability of her scheduled life. The vintage convertible had been purring contentedly for the first 2 hours, but now, on a lonely stretch of road somewhere between civilization and nowhere, it had decided to betray her. Steam rose from beneath the hood in accusatory wisps, and the temperature gauge had climbed into the red zone, despite her fervent wishes otherwise. Ariel pulled onto the narrow shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the Ferrari's tires, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence that followed the engine's death. Rolling hills stretched in every direction, dotted with oak trees and the occasional farmhouse. A hand-painted sign announced that Cedar Creek was 5 miles ahead, though Ariel had never heard of it. Her phone showed 2 bars of signal enough to call for help, but who would she call? Her usual mechanic was 3 hours away, and the roadside assistance service that maintained her fleet of vehicles had already disappointed her twice this month, with their inability to handle vintage Italian engineering. She stepped out of the car, her designer heels sinking slightly into the soft earth beside the road. The October air carried the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke, so different from the perpetual haze of exhaust and ambition that hung over Los Angeles. Despite her frustration, she found herself taking a deep breath, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails from her assistant, messages from board members, reminders about meetings she was now going to miss. On impulse, she opened her social media app and started a live video, something she rarely did without careful planning and professional lighting. "Well, this is not how I plan to spend my Tuesday," she said to the camera, trying to keep her tone light despite the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. "I'm stranded on some back road in the middle of nowhere, and my beautiful Ferrari has decided to throw a tantrum." She turned the camera to show the steam still rising from the hood. "I've called 3 different roadside services in the past hour, and apparently none of them can handle a 1967 Ferrari. So here I am, dressed for a business meeting, standing in a field somewhere north of civilization." The viewer count was climbing rapidly, comments flooding in with suggestions ranging from helpful to ridiculous. Someone suggested she pop the hood and check the radiator fluid. Another viewer recommended calling a helicopter. Most just expressed sympathy or made jokes about rich people problems. "You know what?" Ariel continued, her frustration finally getting the better of her carefully maintained public persona. "I'll marry any man who can fix this car." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, born of exasperation and the kind of dramatic hyperbole that felt safe when directed at strangers on the internet. "I'm serious. Anyone who can get this engine running again can have my hand in marriage. That's how desperate I am right now." She ended the video with a laugh, immediately regretting the outburst, but too annoyed to care about the potential consequences. Within minutes, her phone began buzzing with notifications as the video was shared and reshared, comments multiplying faster than she could read them. Someone had already screenshotted her location from the background landmarks. The hashtag #MarryMeChallenge was beginning to trend. Ariel turned off her phone and leaned against the Ferrari's warm metal, closing her eyes and wondering when her life had become the kind of performance that required constant management. She just wanted to go for a drive, to feel like a normal person for a few hours instead of a carefully crafted brand. Instead, she'd probably just created the kind of viral moment that would dominate entertainment news for weeks. 5 miles down the road, Jack Nolan was listening to Max practice his science fair presentation while he replaced the brake pads on Mrs. Chen's minivan. The boy sat cross-legged on the floor of the garage, his volcano carefully assembled on a piece of cardboard, gesturing enthusiastically as he explained the chemical reaction that would soon create his miniature eruption. And then the carbon dioxide gas builds up pressure inside the volcano, and it has to escape through the opening at the top, which simulates how a real volcano erupts, Max said, his voice carrying the earnest confidence of a child who'd thoroughly studied his subject. "That's perfect, son," Jack said, not looking up from his work but listening to every word. "You explain it so clearly that even old Pete would understand it." "Hey now," Pete called from his usual perch near the coffee pot. "I understood plenty about volcanoes when I was his age. Course, back then we had to walk uphill both ways to see one." Max giggled, a sound that never failed to make Jack smile. These afternoon conversations, with Max doing homework while Jack worked and Pete provided commentary, had become one of his favorite parts of the day. It was the kind of ordinary contentment that he'd learned to treasure after Sarah's death proof that happiness didn't always announce itself with fanfare, but often whispered its presence in small, daily rhythms. "Dad, can we test the volcano when you're done with Mrs. Chen's car?" Max asked. "I want to make sure it works before the science fair tomorrow." "Absolutely," Jack replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "In fact, why don't we do it right now? Mrs. Chen's brakes can wait another few minutes." Max's face lit up as Jack knelt beside him, helping to position the small plastic cup that would hold the vinegar inside the papier-mâché mountain. The volcano was painted in shades of brown and red, with careful attention to detail that spoke of many evenings spent working together at the kitchen table. Max had insisted on adding tiny plastic trees around the base, creating a miniature landscape that would be destroyed in the eruption. "Ready?" Jack asked, holding the vinegar. Max nodded solemnly, his hands poised over the baking soda. 3, 2, on eruption. They added the ingredients simultaneously, and the reaction was immediate and satisfying. Red foam bubbled up and over the volcano's rim, flowing down the sides in convincing lava streams, while Max cheered and Pete applauded from his stool. "Outstanding work, Professor," Jack said, ruffling his son's hair. "That's going to impress everyone at the science fair." "Think I'll win?" Max asked, his eyes still bright with excitement. "I think you've already won the most important thing," Jack replied. "You learned something new, and you had fun doing it. That's what real success looks like." It was then that Jack heard the sounder car engine in distress, growing louder as it approached. Through the open garage bay, he saw a flash of blue as a vintage sports car limped past the window, steam trailing behind it like a distress signal. "Sounds like someone's having car trouble," Pete observed. "That engine's running hotter than a Sunday barbecue." Jack stood and walked to the garage opening, watching as the car pulled off the road about a quarter-mile down. Even from this distance, he could see it was something special, the kind of classic Italian engineering that required patience and expertise to maintain properly. Whoever was driving it was probably going to have a long wait for qualified help, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. "Dad, are you going to help them?" Max asked, having followed his father to the doorway. Jack considered the question. It was after 5, and he'd been planning to close up soon so he could help Max with dinner and homework. But Sarah had always said that kindness was never inconvenient when someone genuinely needed help, and the way that engine had sounded suggested genuine need. "What do you think, Max?" Should we go see if we can help? Max nodded eagerly, already reaching for his jacket. Mum always said we should help people when they're in trouble. Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Max referenced Sarah's teachings, but it was gentler now than it had been in the early days of grief. His son was growing up with his mother's values intact, and that was worth more than any amount of money or recognition. "Pete, can you keep an eye on the shop while we take a look?" "Course I can," Pete replied, settling more comfortably onto his stool. "Take your time. I got nowhere to be and plenty of coffee to keep me company." Jack loaded his portable toolbox into the back of his pickup truck, the same battered Ford that had been faithfully serving the Nolan family for over a decade. Max climbed into the passenger seat, carefully cradling his Volcano in his lap like the precious cargo it was. "Can I help with the car, Dad?" Max asked, as they drove toward the disabled Ferrari. "We'll see what the problem is first," Jack replied. "But you can definitely watch and learn. That's how I learned when I was your age, watching my dad work on engines until I understood how all the pieces fit together." As they approached the stranded vehicle, Jack could see a woman leaning against the driver's side door, her phone pressed to her ear. She was dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that suggested she was far from home, and her posture conveyed the particular brand of frustration that came from having money, but finding it temporarily useless. Jack pulled the truck onto the shoulder behind the Ferrari and stepped out, Max following with his Volcano, still clutched protectively in his arms. The woman looked up from her phone call, and Jack was struck by how young she seemed, despite her obvious sophistication. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested professional competence, but her eyes held a vulnerability that reminded him of Max when he was overwhelmed by something too big for him to handle alone. "Excuse me," Jack called out, raising his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful approach. "I'm a mechanic from town. Looks like you might need some help." The woman ended her phone call and turned to face them fully. Up close, Jack could see that she was probably in her 30s, with the kind of natural beauty that didn't need the expensive clothes and careful styling to be effective. But what struck him most was the relief that flooded her expression when she realized help had arrived. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, and her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested she'd been more worried than she'd wanted to admit. "I've been stuck here for over an hour. The engine just started overheating out of nowhere, and none of the roadside services I called can handle vintage cars." Jack nodded, already moving toward the front of the Ferrari. "Mind if I take a look? I'm Jack Nolan, and this is my son Max." "Ariel," she replied, then paused as if deciding whether to offer her last name. "Ariel Blake, and yes, please, look at whatever you want. I'm completely helpless when it comes to engines." Jack popped the hood and immediately saw the problem: a split radiator hose that had been slowly leaking coolant until the engine overheated. It was the kind of simple repair that would take 15 minutes with the right parts, though finding those parts for a 1967 Ferrari might prove challenging. "Max, come here and look at this," Jack said, pointing to the damaged hose. "What do you think happened?" Max approached carefully, his Volcano still in his arms, and studied the engine with the serious expression he reserved for important learning moments. "The hose got old and cracked, so the coolant leaked out, and the engine got too hot." "Exactly right," Jack confirmed, proud of his son's quick understanding. "Just like when you have a fever, your body needs to cool down or it stops working properly." Ariel watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. She'd expected a gruff mechanic who would either overcharge her or be unable to help at all. Instead, she'd found a patient father teaching his son about engines while treating both her and her expensive car with the same respectful attention he'd probably give to any stranded motorist. "Is it fixable?" she asked, hoping she didn't sound as desperate as she felt. "Absolutely," Jack replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "I don't have the exact hose you need in my truck, but I can patch this temporarily and get you into town. My shop has a better selection of parts, and if I don't have what you need, I can probably fabricate something that'll work." "How much will that cost?" Ariel asked, already reaching for her purse. Jack looked surprised by the question. Let's get your car running first and worry about payment later. Right now, you're stranded, and that's more important than money." It was such a simple statement, delivered with such genuine sincerity, that Ariel found herself staring at this man who'd appeared out of nowhere to help a complete stranger. In her world, every interaction was transactional. Every favor came with expectations attached. The idea that someone would offer help without immediately calculating the benefit seemed almost foreign. Jack worked quickly and efficiently, using a temporary clamp and some high-temperature tape to seal the split hose. Max watched every movement, asking questions about why certain tools were used and how the repair would hold. Throughout the process, neither Jack nor his son seemed to recognize her or treat her as anything other than a person who needed assistance. "There," Jack said finally, closing the hood. "That should get you to town, but don't push it hard. The temporary repair will hold, but you'll want a proper replacement hose as soon as possible." Ariel started the engine, and it turned over smoothly, the temperature gauge remaining in the normal range. The relief she felt was disproportionate to the actual problem, but something about being helpless on the side of the road had triggered a deeper anxiety about her carefully controlled life, spinning out of her control. "I can't thank you enough," she said, meaning every word. "You've completely saved my day." Jack smiled, the kind of easy, unguarded expression that Ariel realized she rarely saw in her professional circle. "Happy to help. That's what neighbors do." "Can I pay you something for your time and materials?" Ariel asked, pulling out her wallet. "That's not necessary," Jack replied. But Ariel was already removing several $100 bills. "Please, I insist. You dropped everything to help a stranger. The least I can do is compensate you for your expertise." Jack looked uncomfortable with the amount of cash she was offering. "Ma'am, that's far too much for a 15-minute patch job. I couldn't take that much money for something so simple." Ariel paused, struck by his obvious discomfort with what she considered a token payment. Then what would be fair? Jack considered the question seriously. "Tell you what, if you really want to do something, would you mind holding Max's volcano while I wash the grease off my hands? He's been working on it for weeks, and I'd hate for it to get damaged while we pack up the tools." It was such an unexpected request that Ariel found herself nodding before she fully processed what he'd asked. Max stepped forward shyly and carefully transferred the papier-mâché volcano into her arms. It was heavier than she'd expected, and clearly built with the kind of loving attention to detail that spoke of many evenings spent working together. "It's for the science fair tomorrow," Max explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's going to erupt with red lava and everything." "It's beautiful work," Ariel said, and she meant it. "You must be very proud of it." Max beamed at the praise, his shyness melting away. "Dad helped me with the chemical part, but I did all the painting myself. Do you want to see it erupt?" Before Ariel could answer, Max was already digging in his pocket for the small containers of baking soda and vinegar he'd brought along for the demonstration. Jack, having finished cleaning his hands, returned to find his son preparing to set off his volcano in the middle of the highway shoulder. "Max, maybe we should wait," Jack began, but Ariel surprised them both by kneeling down beside the boy. "I'd love to see it," she said. "I've never seen a volcano erupt before, even a small one." Max's excitement was infectious as he carefully measured the ingredients and explained the chemical reaction that was about to take place. When the volcano erupted in a satisfying display of red foam, Ariel found herself clapping with genuine delight, her expensive clothes forgotten as she knelt in the dust beside a child who was proud of his science project. "That was amazing," she said, helping Max carefully clean the foam from his volcano. "You're going to do wonderfully at the science fair." As they packed up the tools and prepared to part ways, Ariel realized that she'd just experienced something she couldn't remember feeling in years, the simple pleasure of human connection without agenda or calculation. Jack had helped her because she needed help. Max had shared his volcano because he was proud of it and wanted someone to appreciate his work. There had been no networking, no strategic positioning, no careful consideration of mutual benefit. "Thank you again," she said, settling back into the Ferrari's driver's seat. "Both of you. You've reminded me that there are still genuinely good people in the world. Jack tipped an imaginary hat. Drive safely, and remember to get that hose replaced as soon as you can. As Ariel drove away, she watched Jack and Max in her rearview mirror, loading their tools into the pickup truck, with the easy cooperation of a father and son who were comfortable in each other's company. It struck her that she'd just encountered something she'd been searching for, without realizing it, the kind of authentic human connection that had nothing to do with wealth or status or careful image management. Behind her, Jack was helping Max secure his volcano for the ride back to town when the boy asked, "Dad, why didn't the pretty lady want to pay us?" "She did want to pay us, son. But sometimes the most valuable things can't be bought with money." "Like what?" Jack considered the question as he started the truck. "Like the feeling you get when you help someone who really needs it. Like the satisfaction of fixing something that's broken. Like the time we spend together working on your volcano." He paused, thinking about the woman who'd just driven away and the genuine gratitude in her eyes when she'd watched Max's demonstration. Like the connection you make with another person when you treat them with kindness, no matter who they are or where they come from. Max nodded solemnly, filing this lesson away with all the others his father had taught him about how to move through the world with decency and compassion. As they drove back toward town, neither of them realized that the encounter they'd just shared would soon change all their lives in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. In her Ferrari, now running smoothly toward Cedar Creek, Ariel finally remembered to turn her phone back on. The screen immediately exploded with notifications, hundreds of comments on her livestream, missed calls from her publicist, text messages from board members who'd seen the viral video. The hashtag #MarryMeChallenge was trending worldwide, and entertainment news outlets were already running stories about the tech heiress who'd promised to marry anyone who could fix her car. She'd completely forgotten about the impulsive joke she'd made to her social media followers, too caught up in the simple human kindness she'd just experienced to remember that her life was constantly being observed and analyzed by millions of strangers. Now, driving toward the small town where her unlikely rescuer lived, she realized that her moment of frustration had just created exactly the kind of public spectacle she'd been trying to escape. But for the first time in months, the thought of dealing with the media circus didn't fill her with dread. Instead, she found herself thinking about Max's proud smile when his volcano erupted, and Jack's refusal to accept payment for a simple act of kindness, and the possibility that somewhere in this small mountain town she might find something worth more than all the money and fame in the world. By the time Ariel reached the Cedar Creek Motor Lodge, her phone had buzzed so relentlessly that she'd finally turned off all notifications just to think clearly. The motel was exactly what she'd expected from a small mountain town, clean but simple, with a hand-painted sign advertising cable, television, and free coffee, as if these were remarkable amenities. The elderly clerk seemed genuinely pleased to have a guest and didn't appear to recognize her, a small mercy in what was shaping up to be a complicated evening. Her room overlooked the main street, where the last light of October was painting the storefronts in shades of gold and amber. Through her window, she could see Nolan's Auto Repair, its modest sign glowing softly in the gathering dusk. A warm yellow light spilled from the windows, and she could make out Jack's silhouette moving around inside, probably finishing up the day's work before heading home to dinner with Max. The normalcy of it struck her profoundly. Here was a man who closed his shop at a reasonable hour, who went home to help his son with homework and probably read bedtime stories and worried about ordinary things like school projects and grocery bills. It was the kind of life she'd given up without even realizing she was making a choice, trading the possibility of simple contentment for the endless demands of empire building. Ariel forced herself to turn her phone back on and immediately regretted it. The screen filled with a chaos of notifications that would have overwhelmed a team of assistants. Her publicist had called 17 times. The legal department wanted to discuss liability issues. Her assistant had forwarded 36 interview requests from entertainment reporters who wanted to know if she was serious about the marriage challenge. Most disturbing were the messages from her business partners, Marcus Webb and Patricia Vance, the two senior executives who joined Blake Technologies during the rapid expansion after her father's death. Their texts had an urgency that made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Need to discuss the video situation immediately," Marcus had written. "This could be a significant opportunity if we handle it correctly." Patricia's message was more direct. "The board is concerned about brand implications. We need damage control strategies in place by morning." Ariel sank onto the motel room's simple bed and stared at the messages, feeling the weight of her carefully constructed life pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd made a jokier moment of genuine frustration, expressed without filters or focus groups or strategic consideration, and already her team was calculating how to monetize it or minimize it, depending on which approach served. Company better. She opened her laptop and found that someone had already created a Wikipedia page for the Blake Marriage Challenge, complete with speculation about her motives and analysis of the potential publicity value. Social media was exploding with memes, reaction videos, and earnest discussions about whether her offer was legally binding. A betting pool had emerged on various platforms, with odds being calculated on everything from whether she'd follow through to who might actually show up to claim the prize. The whole thing felt surreal and slightly nauseating. Somewhere in the digital chaos, the simple human moment she'd shared with Jack and Max had been lost, transformed into content for people who saw her as entertainment rather than a person. She thought about Jack's confused expression when she'd tried to pay him, how he'd asked her to hold Max's volcano instead of accepting money. In a world where everything had become transactional, she'd encountered someone who still operated on principles of simple kindness. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. When she opened it, she found a teenage girl holding a plate covered with a checkered napkin, smiling with the kind of genuine warmth that seemed to be standard in this town. "Hi, I'm Emma. My mom owns the diner across the street, and she thought you might be hungry. Most folks don't know we deliver, but when someone's staying at the motel alone, Mom likes to make sure they get a proper meal." Ariel accepted the plate, which was still warm and smelled like comfort food made with actual care. "That's incredibly thoughtful. How much do I owe you?" Emma waved dismissively. "Mom said not to take any money. She figures if you're staying here instead of driving onto the fancy resort up the mountain, you probably had car trouble, and nobody should have to deal with car trouble on an empty stomach." After Emma left, Ariel sat with the plate of what turned out to be meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green bean simple food, prepared with the kind of attention that made it taste like someone actually cared whether she enjoyed it. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything that hadn't been catered by professionals or ordered from restaurants, where the presentation mattered more than the nourishment. As she ate, she found herself thinking about the conversation she'd overheard between Jack and Max, about the science fair, the easy affection between father and son, the way Jack had patiently explained the repair process while including Max in the work. It was the kind of family dynamic she'd grown up with before her father's business consumed more and more of his attention, before success had isolated them both behind walls of responsibility and expectation. Her phone rang, and she saw her publicist's name on the screen. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Ariel?" "Thank God," came Stephanie's voice, breathless with the kind of dramatic urgency that suggested either genuine crisis or calculated manipulation. "We need to talk about this video situation. The engagement numbers are incredible, over 50 million views in 6 hours, but we need to get ahead of the narrative before it spirals out of control." "What narrative?" Ariel asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "Well, some outlets are playing it as a charming moment of vulnerability, but others are suggesting it's a publicity stunt for a product launch, or that you're having some kind of breakdown. Marcus and Patricia want to schedule an emergency board meeting to discuss brand management strategies." Ariel felt something cold settle in her stomach. Brand management strategies for what? "I made a joke when my car broke down. I didn't announce a new product line." But that's exactly the opportunity, Stephanie continued, her voice rising with excitement. We could partner with a dating app, or create a limited edition car care line, or develop this into a whole campaign about modern romance and female empowerment. The possibilities are endless. Or, Ariel said slowly, we could let it die down naturally like any other social media moment. There was a pause that felt heavy with disapproval. Ariel, honey, you have 50 million people paying attention to you right now. From a business perspective, it would be irresponsible not to capitalize on that level of engagement. After ending the call, Ariel sat in the growing darkness of her motel room, feeling the familiar weight of expectation settling around her shoulders. Everyone wanted to turn her moment of genuine frustration into a marketing opportunity, to transform her brief encounter with authentic human kindness into content that could be packaged and sold. The idea that she might simply want to thank the man who'd helped her, or that she might have been touched by his son's innocent pride in his science project, didn't factor into anyone's strategic calculations. She opened her laptop again and began typing. Not a press release or a damage control statement, but a simple letter to Jack Nolan. She wrote about his kindness, about Max's wonderful volcano demonstration, about how their genuine warmth had reminded her that not every human interaction needed to be calculated for maximum advantage. She wrote about wanting to thank them properly, not with money that made Jack uncomfortable, but with a gesture that acknowledged the gift they'd given her without expecting anything in return. When she finished, she read the letter 3 times, editing out the business jargon that crept in automatically, softening the formal language until it sounded like something one human being might actually say to another. Then she printed it on the motel's ancient printer and hand-addressed an envelope, using the return address of the Cedar Creek Motor Lodge rather than any of her corporate addresses. The act of writing by hand, of folding the letter and sealing the envelope, felt like a small rebellion against the digital chaos that was consuming her life. In a world where every communication was immediately screenshot and analyzed and shared, there was something revolutionary about a private message between 2 people who'd shared a genuine moment of connection. The next morning, she walked to the post office, an actual walk, not a ride in a chauffeured car, and mailed the letter herself. The postal clerk, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and no apparent interest in celebrity gossip, accepted the letter with the same careful attention she'd probably given thousands of others. "That'll get there tomorrow," the clerk said. "Local mail moves pretty quick around here." As Ariel walked back toward the motel, she passed the elementary school where Max was presumably presenting his volcano to judges who would evaluate it based on scientific accuracy and presentation rather than market potential or viral possibilities. She imagined him standing proudly beside his careful work, explaining the chemical reactions with the same enthusiasm he'd shown her on the roadside. The simplicity of a child, proud of what he'd learned and created, sharing that knowledge with others who cared about education rather than entertainment, value struck her as the most valuable thing she'd encountered in months. In her world, everything was focus-grouped and optimized and leveraged for maximum impact. But Max's volcano was just a volcano, built with love and patience, and the desire to understand how things worked. Her phone was buzzing again, but for the first time in years, Ariel ignored it. Instead, she sat on the bench outside the post office and watched the town wake up around her shopkeepers, opening their doors, parents dropping children at school, people greeting each other with the kind of casual familiarity that came from being part of a community rather than a network. When she finally returned to the motel and checked her messages, she found what she'd expected. Marcus and Patricia had scheduled the emergency board meeting for that afternoon, conducted via video conference since she was indisposed in some mountain town. The agenda was titled Blake Marriage Challenge, Risk Assessment and Opportunity Maximization. The clinical language made her feel slightly sick. They were treating her impulsive moment of frustration as if it were a product launch gone wrong, something to be managed and controlled and ultimately transformed into profit. The human element, the kindness she'd received, the connection she'd felt, the simple desire to express gratitude was nowhere in their strategic considerations. Ariel closed her laptop without responding to any of the meeting requests. Instead, she walked to the diner where Emma's mother worked, ordered coffee and toast she didn't really want, and sat by the window, watching life happen at a pace that allowed for conversation and consideration rather than constant reaction. The waitress, a woman about her own age with tired eyes and a genuine smile, refilled her coffee without being asked and didn't seem to expect conversation beyond basic politeness. It was the kind of anonymous kindness that Ariel had forgotten. Existed help offered, without expectation of recognition or reward. As she sat there, Ariel found herself thinking about the letter she'd mailed to Jack, wondering if he'd understand what she'd been trying to say, if he'd recognize the gratitude behind her clumsy attempt to express how much his simple kindness had meant to her. In a life where every gesture was calculated for maximum impact, the act of writing something purely from the heart felt both foreign and necessary. She thought about Max, probably at school now, maybe telling his friends about the lady with the broken car who'd watched his volcano erupt. To him, it had just been a moment of sharing something he was proud of with someone who appreciated it. He had no idea that his innocent demonstration had taken place in the middle of a media storm, that his father's simple act of kindness was being dissected by strangers who saw it as content rather than character. The purity of their perspective, the way they'd treated her as just another person who needed help, felt like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. In a world where her every move was analyzed for strategic advantage, they'd offered her something far more valuable than any business opportunity, the reminder that kindness existed without agenda, that connection was possible without calculation, and that sometimes the most important transactions were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars or engagement metrics. As she finished her coffee and prepared to face whatever crisis her business partners had manufactured in her absence, Ariel held onto the memory of Jack's uncomfortable smile when she'd tried to pay him, and Max's proud expression when his volcano erupted on schedule. Whatever happened next, whatever strategic opportunities or damage control measures her team implemented, she would remember that for a few minutes, on a dusty roadside, she'd been treated like a human being rather than a brand. That memory, she decided, was worth protecting, even if it meant disappointing people who saw every moment of her life as an opportunity to be optimized for maximum return. Jack found the letter waiting for him when he returned from dropping Max at school Thursday morning, mixed in with the usual collection of bills and automotive supply catalogs that constituted his daily mail. The return address caught his attention, Cedar Creek Motor Lodge, and he wondered who might be writing to him from the town's only accommodation for overnight visitors. The handwriting was careful and feminine, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who'd been taught that presentation mattered. Jack opened the envelope while walking back toward his garage, expecting perhaps a note from a customer who'd stayed overnight while their car was being repaired. Instead, he found 3 pages of what was clearly a heartfelt expression of gratitude from the woman whose Ferrari he'd fixed 2 days earlier. Ariel Blakesh included her full name in the letter, though it meant nothing to him, had written to thank him and Max for their kindness. But the tone of the letter suggested something deeper than simple appreciation for roadside assistance. She wrote about how rare it had become in her life to encounter genuine kindness without ulterior motives, how Max's enthusiasm for his science project had reminded her of the joy of learning for its own sake rather than for strategic advantage. She described feeling isolated despite being constantly surrounded by people, and how their simple family dynamic had shown her what she'd been missing in her carefully orchestrated existence. The letter was honest in a way that surprised Jack. Most people, in his experience, kept their vulnerabilities carefully hidden, especially when writing to relative strangers. But Ariel had shared her loneliness, her sense that she'd lost touch with the things that truly mattered, her gratitude for being treated like a person rather than whatever it was people usually treated her like. Jack read the letter twice, sitting on the bench outside his garage in the morning sunshine, trying to reconcile the vulnerable person who'd written these words with the composed woman who'd stood beside her expensive car just days before. There had been something in her eyes when she'd watched Max's volcano demonstration, a kind of wonder that seemed disproportionate to a simple science project. Now he understood what he'd been seeing, someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to witness pure joy without calculating its value or strategic importance. The final paragraph of the letter made an unexpected request. Rather than offering money again, which she acknowledged had made him uncomfortable, Ariel asked if she might invite him and Max to visit her in Los Angeles for a weekend. Not as a publicity stunt or business opportunity, she was careful to clarify, but as a genuine gesture of thanks and perhaps the beginning of what she hoped might be a friendship. "I realize this might seem strange," she'd written, "coming from someone you barely know. But your kindness reminded me that the best things in life can't be bought or negotiated or strategically acquired. They have to be freely given and gratefully received. I'd like to share some of my world with you and Max, the parts of it that I think might bring him joy, as a way of saying thank you for sharing yours with me." Jack folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope, unsure how to feel about the invitation. The idea of taking Max to Los Angeles was both intriguing and unsettling. The boy had never been to a big city, had never seen the ocean, or experienced the kind of luxury that Ariel's life presumably offered. It might be an adventure that would expand his horizons and create memories to last a lifetime. On the other hand, Jack had worked hard to create a stable, predictable environment for Max after Sarah's death. Their life in Cedar Creek was simple but secure, built on routines and relationships that had helped both of them heal from their loss. Taking Max into Ariel's world, whatever that world might look like, felt like, introducing variables that could disrupt the careful balance they'd achieved. Pete shuffled into the garage around 9 o'clock, carrying his usual thermos of coffee and ready to provide commentary on whatever projects Jack had planned for the day. He noticed the letter immediately, probably because Jack was still holding it instead of going about his normal morning routine. "Good news or bad news?" Pete asked, settling onto his favorite stool and eyeing the envelope with the curiosity of someone who'd lived in a small town long enough to find everyone's business mildly interesting. "Not sure yet," Jack replied honestly. "Remember the woman with the Ferrari? She sent a thank you note." Pete's eyebrows rose with interest. "Must have been quite a thank you note to put that expression on your face. Most folks just say thanks and drive away." Jack found himself sharing the contents of the letter, partly because Pete's opinion often helped him think through complicated situations, and partly because the old man had become something of a surrogate grandfather to Max since Sarah's death. If anyone would understand Jack's conflicted feelings about the invitation, it would be Pete. "So she wants to take you and the boy to Los Angeles for a weekend," Pete mused after Jack finished explaining. "Interesting proposition. When's the last time either of you left Cedar Creek for anything more exciting than a trip to the county fair?" "That's not the point," Jack said, though he wasn't entirely sure what the point was. "Max is happy here. He's got his friends, his school, his routine. I don't want to confuse him by exposing him to a lifestyle we could never provide." Pete sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Or maybe you don't want to confuse yourself." The observation hit closer to home than Jack wanted to admit. Since Sarah's death, he'd built his life around certainty and control, around creating an environment where he could predict and manage the variables that might affect Max's happiness and security. The idea of stepping into someone else's world, especially someone whose life was presumably far more complicated and sophisticated than his own, felt like an invitation to chaos. "There's nothing wrong with being cautious," Pete continued, "but there's also nothing wrong with letting the boy see what's beyond these mountains. Might give him something to dream about, something to work toward. Or it might make him dissatisfied with what we have here." "Could be," Pete agreed, "or it might make him appreciate what we have here even more. You won't know until you try." Jack spent the morning working on routine maintenance tasks while thinking about Ariel's letter and Pete's advice. Around noon, When the lunch crowd was settling into the diner across the street, he was surprised to see a van with television station markings pull up outside his garage. Two people got out, a reporter he didn't recognize and a cameraman carrying equipment that looked expensive and professional. "Mr. Nolan," the reporter called out, approaching with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she'd done this many times before. "I'm Jessica Martinez from Channel 7 News. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your encounter with Ariel Blake earlier this week." Jack felt his stomach drop. "I'm sorry. Encounter with who?" "Ariel Blake, the tech billionaire, whose marriage challenge video has gone viral. Our sources tell us you were the mechanic who fixed her car. Is that correct?" The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The woman whose Ferrari he'd repaired wasn't just someone with an expensive car and a grateful heart. She was apparently someone famous enough to warrant news coverage, someone whose spontaneous joke had created the kind of media attention that could reach all the way to Cedar Creek. "I helped someone with car trouble," Jack said carefully. "I do that pretty regularly. It's my job." "But this was different, wasn't it?" the reporter pressed. "Ms. Blake live-streamed a video saying she'd marry anyone who could fix her car. Are you planning to take her up on that offer?" Jack stared at the reporter, trying to process what he was hearing. The woman who'd written him such a thoughtful, vulnerable letter was apparently involved in some kind of public spectacle that he'd unknowingly become part of. The marriage comment she'd mentioned in her letter wasn't just a private joke between it was something she'd broadcast to the world. "I don't know anything about a marriage offer," Jack said, which was technically true. "I stopped to help someone whose car had broken down. That's what people do around here." The reporter exchanged a look with her cameraman, clearly disappointed by Jack's lack of cooperation. "Would you be willing to comment on Miss Blake's invitation for you to visit her in Los Angeles? Our sources say she's planning to fly you and your son to California as part of the challenge." Jack felt something cold settle in his chest. How did reporters know about Ariel's invitation when he'd only received the letter that morning? Unless the invitation wasn't as private as she'd made it seem, unless this was all part of whatever public spectacle she'd created with her viral video. "I need to get back to work," Jack said, already moving toward his garage. "I don't have any comments about anything." But the damage was done. As the news van pulled away, Jack could see curtains twitching in windows across the street. Neighbors who'd witnessed the brief interview and would undoubtedly be curious about what kind of story had brought television reporters to their quiet town. Pete had watched the entire exchange from his stool inside the garage, his expression thoughtful and slightly concerned. "Well," he said when Jack rejoined him, "I reckon that changes things a bit." Jack felt simultaneously betrayed and foolish. Ariel's letter had seemed so genuine, so personal, that he'd never considered it might be part of some larger performance for public consumption. Now he wondered if her vulnerability had been calculated, if her gratitude was just another move in whatever game she was playing with her viral video. "Max is going to hear about this at school," Jack said, suddenly worried about how his 8-year-old son would handle being the center of unwanted attention. "The other kids, their parents, everyone's going to know we got mixed up in some celebrity's publicity stunt." "Might not be a publicity stunt," Pete offered, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Could be the woman genuinely appreciates what you did for her, and the publicity is just something that happened around it." Jack wanted to believe that, but the reporter's questions had planted seeds of doubt that were growing rapidly. If Ariel had really wanted to thank him privately, why had reporters somehow learned about her invitation? How had they even found him, unless someone from her team had provided the information? His phone rang, and he saw a number he didn't recognize with a Los Angeles area code. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Nolan, this is Stephanie Chen, Ms. Blake's publicist. I understand there was a minor media incident at your location today. Ms. Blake wanted me to call and apologize for any inconvenience." The formal tone, the phrase, media incident, the fact that Ariel had sent her publicist rather than calling herself everything about the conversation confirmed Jack's growing suspicion that he'd been naive about the nature of their interaction. "Is that what this is?" Jack asked. "A media incident?" Well, Ms. Blake's video has generated significant public interest, as I'm sure you can understand. She's very grateful for your assistance and hopes you'll still consider her invitation to visit Los Angeles. Her invitation that somehow became public knowledge before I'd even had a chance to respond to it. There was a pause that felt heavy with calculation. Miss Blake values her privacy, Mr. Nolan, but sometimes information leaks despite our best efforts to control it. She hopes you understand that her gratitude is genuine, regardless of the surrounding circumstances. After ending the call, Jack sat in his garage staring at Ariel's letter, trying to reconcile the vulnerable woman who'd written it with the celebrity, who apparently commanded teams of publicists and generated enough public interest to bring reporters to Cedar Creek. Maybe both versions were real. Maybe she was genuinely grateful, while simultaneously being part of a world where everything became public spectacle, whether she intended it or not. The uncertainty gnawed at him throughout the afternoon. When Max came home from school, bouncing with excitement about his second-place finish in the science fair, Jack had to force himself to focus on his son's achievement rather than his own confusion about the morning's events. Mrs. Henderson said my explanation was really clear, Max reported, carefully setting his small trophy on the workbench where it could be properly admired, and Tommy Morrison said he wished his volcano had erupted as good as mine. I'm proud of you, Jack said, meaning every word. You worked hard on that project and it showed. It was only later, after Max had gone to bed, that Jack allowed himself to really think about Ariel's invitation and what it might mean for both of them. The letter had touched something in him that he'd thought was permanently buried with Sarathy. Possibility of connection with someone who saw him as more than just a widowed father trying to hold his small world together. But the reporter's visit had reminded him that Ariel's world operated by different rules than his own, rules that included publicity and scrutiny, and the kind of attention that could disrupt the careful peace he'd built for Max. Even if her gratitude was genuine, even if her invitation came from the heart, accepting it would mean stepping into a situation he couldn't control or predict. Jack picked up the letter one more time, reading her words about isolation and genuine human connection, about how rare it had become in her life to encounter kindness without ulterior motives. Maybe that was the answer. Maybe her world had made genuine connection so difficult that even she couldn't tell the difference between authentic gratitude and strategic performance. The question was whether he was willing to take the risk of finding out which version was real, knowing that whatever he decided would affect not just his own life, but Max's as well. His son deserved adventures and expanded horizons, but he also deserved stability and protection from the kind of chaos that seemed to follow people like Ariel Blake. As Jack turned off the lights in his garage and headed home to his quiet house, he realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, he was facing a decision that couldn't be made based purely on what was safe and predictable. Sometimes he was beginning to understand the most important choices were the ones that required a leap of faith into an uncertain future. The question was whether he was brave enough to make that leap, and whether he could trust that the woman who'd written such a vulnerable letter would catch him if he fell. The wedding ring on Jack's finger caught the morning light as he poured coffee, the simple gold band that had become as much a part of him as his own skin over the past 11 years. He'd worn it through Sarah's illness, through the lonely months after her funeral, through every day of rebuilding their life into something Max could trust and depend on. Now, 3 years later, he still reached for it unconsciously when he was thinking or worried, rolling the smooth metal between his fingers like a talisman against uncertainty. This morning, uncertainty seemed to fill every corner of his small kitchen. Max sat at the table, spooning cereal into his mouth while reading the back of the cereal box with the intense concentration he brought to everything that captured his interest. The normalcy of the scene father and son sharing breakfast before school felt precious in a way that made Jack's chest tight with protective instinct. "Dad, are we really going to visit the pretty lady in Los Angeles?" Max asked, without looking up from his cereal box, his tone suggesting the question had been building pressure like steam in one of his volcano experiments. Jack had been dreading this conversation since the previous evening. When he'd finally decided to accept Ariel's invitation, despite his reservations about the media attention and the complications it might bring to their carefully ordered life. He'd called the number from her publicist's business card and left a message saying they would come for the weekend, but only if certain conditions could be met: no media coverage, no publicity events, just a private visit between people who'd shared a moment of genuine connection. "We are," Jack confirmed, sitting down across from his son. "But it's just for a weekend, and it's just to say thank you properly for helping her when her car broke down." Max's face lit up with the kind of uncomplicated excitement that Jack envied. At 8 years old, his son hadn't yet learned to analyze every situation for potential complications or to worry about motives and consequences. For Max, an invitation to visit someone interesting was simply an adventure to be anticipated. "Will we see the ocean?" Max asked. "Tommy Morrison says Los Angeles is right next to the ocean, and you can see for miles and miles." "We might," Jack said, realizing that he hadn't actually asked Ariel what she had planned for their visit. Her letter had mentioned wanting to share parts of her world that might bring Max joy, but she hadn't been specific about what that meant. "We'll see what she has in mind." The truth was that Jack had no idea what to expect from a weekend in Ariel Blake's world. His research the previous evening, few careful internet searches that had revealed more about her wealth and influence than he'd been prepared for, had shown him pictures of a lifestyle so far removed from his own experience that it might as well have been taking place on another planet. Blake Technologies, he'd learned, was worth billions of dollars and employed thousands of people around the world. Ariel herself was apparently considered one of the most successful female entrepreneurs of her generation, a frequent speaker at conferences and the subject of magazine profiles that described her as brilliant, driven, and notoriously private. The photos showed a woman who looked polished and confident in ways that bore little resemblance to the vulnerable person who'd written him such a heartfelt letter. But it was the wedding ring on his own finger that worried him most as he watched Max's excitement about their upcoming trip. For 3 years, that ring had been his anchor to the life he'd built with Sarah, a reminder of promises made and kept and the love that had shaped every decision since her death. Wearing it felt like carrying her with him, like honoring the family they'd created together, even as he worked to help Max grow beyond the shadow of her absence. Now, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, Jack found himself wondering if wearing her ring while visiting another woman, even for perfectly innocent reasons, was somehow disloyal to her memory. The question felt both important and impossible to answer, tangled up with guilt and grief, and the growing realization that his feelings about Ariel Blake were more complicated than simple gratitude for her letter would warrant. He'd been attracted to her from the moment she'd looked up from her phone with relief in her eyes, though he'd immediately pushed that awareness aside as inappropriate and irrelevant. She was a stranger whose car had broken down, someone who needed help, and his job was to provide that help without considering anything beyond her immediate practical needs. But her letter had changed something, had revealed a depth and vulnerability that made her seem less like a distant celebrity and more like a person he might actually want to know better. The loneliness she'd described, the sense of being surrounded by people who saw her as a symbol rather than a human being, resonated with his own experience of being defined primarily by his role as Max's father and Sarah's widower. "Dad, you're twisting your ring again," Max observed, his 8-year-old ability to notice everything sometimes startling in its accuracy. Jack looked down at his hand, realizing that he'd been unconsciously rolling Sarah's wedding ring between his fingers while thinking about Ariel. The gesture had become so automatic over the years that he rarely noticed it anymore, but Max had grown up watching his father work through complicated emotions with that simple, repetitive motion. "I was just thinking," Jack said, which was true enough. "About Mom?" Max asked, his voice carrying the gentle directness that children used when addressing subjects that made adults uncomfortable. Jack considered the question carefully. He had been thinking about Sarah, but not in the way Max probably meant. He'd been wondering what she would think about his accepting Ariel's invitation, whether she would approve of him taking Max into a world so different from the one they'd built together in Cedar Creek. "A little," Jack admitted. "I was wondering what she'd think about our trip to Los Angeles." Max tilted his head thoughtfully, a gesture that reminded Jack so powerfully of Sarah that it took his breath away for a moment. "I think she'd be excited for us," Max said with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his mother's love or her desire for his happiness. "She always said adventures were good for people, even if they made you nervous at first." The simple wisdom of his son's observation hit Jack with unexpected force. Sarah had been the adventurous one in their relationship, the one who'd pushed him to take risks and try new things and trust that everything would work out if they faced it together. She'd probably have been fascinated by Ariel's letter and eager to meet the woman who'd written it. More than that, she would have wanted Max to see the world beyond Cedar Creek, to understand that there were many different ways to live and many different kinds of people worth knowing. She'd never wanted their son to feel limited by the circumstances of his upbringing or afraid to reach beyond the familiar boundaries of their small town. "You're probably right," Jack said, meaning it. "Mom always did like meeting new people. And she liked it when people were nice to us," Max added. "The pretty lady was really nice when she watched my volcano. She seemed like she really wanted to see it work." That was what had struck Jack most about Ariel's interaction with Max, the genuine interest she'd shown in his science project, the way she'd knelt in the dust beside him without worrying about her expensive clothes, the delight in her face when the volcano erupted on schedule. It had been the reaction of someone who rarely encountered pure enthusiasm and found it refreshing. After dropping Max at school, Jack returned to his garage to find Pete already settled on his usual stool, thermos in hand, and ready to provide commentary on whatever the day might bring. The old man had an uncanny ability to sense when important conversations were needed, and this morning his expression suggested he was prepared for one. "So," Pete said without preamble, "you decided to take the boy to Los Angeles." Jack nodded, not surprised that Pete had intuited his decision before he'd had a chance to announce it. "We're leaving Friday afternoon, coming back Sunday evening." "Good for you," Pete said, his approval evident in his tone. "Boy needs to see something beyond these mountains before he gets too set in his ways." "What if it's too much for him?" Jack asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in his mind since he'd made the decision. "What if he sees her world and starts thinking there's something wrong with ours?" Pete sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Then you'll remind him that there's nothing wrong with honest work and simple pleasures, and that the best parts of any life are the people you share it with, not the stuff you accumulate along the way." It was the kind of straightforward wisdom that Pete specialized in, the distillation of 7 decades of living into principles that could guide someone through almost any situation. But Jack's concerns went deeper than worry about Max's reaction to luxury and privilege. "I keep thinking about Sarah," Jack admitted, "about what it means that I'm taking her son to visit another woman, even if it's just to say thank you." Pete set down his coffee cup and looked at Jack with the direct gaze that had probably helped him navigate his own complicated moments over the years. "Son, Sarah's been gone for 3 years. That's long enough for even the most devoted husband to start thinking about what comes next." "I'm not thinking about what comes next," Jack protested, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. "Maybe you should be," Pete said gently. "Not because you love Sarah any less, but because she loved you and the boy enough to want you both to be happy, even if that happiness eventually includes someone else." The conversation felt both necessary and terrifying, touching on possibilities that Jack had been carefully avoiding since Sarah's death. He'd told himself that his focus needed to be entirely on Max, on providing stability and consistency, and all the things an 8-year-old needed to feel secure in the world. The idea of introducing romantic complications into their carefully balanced life seemed like an unnecessary risk. But Pete's words forced him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding. His interest in Ariel Blake went beyond gratitude for her letter or curiosity about her world. There had been something in her eyes when she'd watched Max's volcano demonstration, something vulnerable and real that had stirred feelings he'd thought were permanently buried with his wife. "It's just a weekend visit," Jack said, as much to convince himself as Pete. "She wanted to thank us properly, and I thought it might be good for Max to see something different." "Might be good for you too," Pete observed. "When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because it was good for the boy or necessary for the business?" Jack couldn't remember, which was probably answer enough. Since Sarah's death, every decision had been filtered through the lens of what was best for Max, what would provide the most stability, what would keep their small world safe and predictable. The idea of wanting something for himself, wanting someone for himself, felt both foreign and dangerous. "She's not from our world, Pete," Jack said finally. "The reporters, the publicity, the kind of life she lives, it's all completely different from anything we know." "Different doesn't necessarily mean wrong," Pete replied. "Sometimes different is exactly what a person needs to remember who they used to be before life taught them to settle for safe and predictable." The words stung because they carried more truth than Jack wanted to acknowledge. Before Sarah's illness and death, he'd been more adventurous, more willing to take risks and embrace uncertainty. Becoming a single father had required him to become more cautious, more focused on security and routine. But somewhere in that necessary transformation, he'd lost touch with the part of himself that Sarah had fallen in love with in the first place. Maybe that was what Ariel had seen when she'd watched their interaction with Max, not just a competent mechanic and devoted father, but glimpses of the man who'd once been willing to dream beyond the comfortable boundaries of his small-town life. Maybe her invitation was as much about helping him rediscover that person as it was about expressing gratitude for roadside assistance. The morning passed quietly, with Jack working on routine repairs while thinking about the weekend ahead and what it might mean for both him and Max. Around noon, his phone rang with a call from the number he'd memorized over the past few days, Ariel's publicist, probably calling to confirm details about their visit. Instead, he heard Ariel's voice, soft and slightly uncertain. "Jack, this is Ariel Blake. I hope you don't mind that I called directly instead of going through Stephanie." "Of course not," Jack said, surprised by how much he'd wanted to hear her voice again. "I got your letter. It was thank you for writing it. I wasn't sure how you'd feel about the invitation, especially after the reporters showed up. I'm sorry about that, by the way. Sometimes my world spills over into other people's lives, whether I want it to or not." There was something in her tone that suggested she'd been as unsettled by the media attention as he had been, that the publicity surrounding their encounter was as unwelcome to her as it was to him. It made him feel less like he'd been naive and more like they were both navigating something unexpected together. "Max is excited about the trip," Jack said. "He's never seen the ocean." "I was hoping," Ariel paused, and Jack could hear something like nervousness in her voice. "I was hoping we could keep it simple. No fancy restaurants or events, just, I don't know, normal things that might be fun for an 8-year-old. The beach, maybe some museums, whatever he might enjoy." The uncertainty in her voice reminded Jack of the vulnerable woman who'd written him such a heartfelt letter, and he felt some of his own nervousness ease. Whatever complications her world might contain, her desire to make Max happy seemed genuine and uncalculated. "That sounds perfect," Jack said. "He's pretty easy to please as long as he feels like the adults around him are paying attention to what he cares about." "I remember," Ariel said softly. "The way he explained his volcano, just wanted someone to appreciate what he'd learned and created. That's such a pure way of sharing yourself with the world." The conversation continued for another few minutes, covering practical details about their flight and accommodation. But Jack found himself listening less to the logistics and more to the tone of Ariel's voice. She sounded lonely in a way that transcended her wealth and success, like someone who'd achieved everything she'd thought she wanted, only to discover that achievement without connection felt hollow. After the call ended, Jack sat in his garage staring at Sarah's wedding ring, thinking about the woman who'd written him a letter that had changed something fundamental in how he thought about his own life. For 3 years, he'd been focused entirely on preserving what he and Sarah had built together, on protecting Max from any disruption to the stability they'd created in the aftermath of loss. But maybe preservation wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it was time to consider what Sarah would have wanted them to build next, what kind of life she would have encouraged them to create as they grew beyond the immediate aftermath of grief. When Max came home from school that afternoon, Jack told him about the phone call and the plans they'd made for their weekend in Los Angeles. His son's excitement was infectious, uncomplicated by the doubts and uncertainties that plagued adult decision-making. "Will we really see the ocean, Dad?" Max asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. "We really will," Jack confirmed, and for the first time since accepting Ariel's invitation, he felt more excited than nervous about what the weekend might bring. That evening, as he helped Max pack for their trip, Jack found himself looking forward to seeing Ariel again, to continuing the conversation they'd started on a dusty roadside and developed through her letter and phone call. Whatever happened, whatever complications or revelations the weekend might bring, he was finally ready to find out if the connection he'd felt with her was real or just the product of his own loneliness and long-suppressed hopes for something beyond the careful life he'd built in the shadow of loss. The private jet that Ariel had sent for them was smaller than the commercial aircraft Jack had expected, but infinitely more luxurious than anything he and Max had ever experienced. The flight attendant, a woman about Jack's age with a warm smile and infinite patience for 8-year-old questions, explained every aspect of the aircraft that captured Max's curiosity, from the pressurization system to the navigation equipment to the small kitchen where she prepared fresh sandwiches for their lunch. Max pressed his face to the window as they descended toward Los Angeles, watching the sprawling city spread out below them like a vast electric circuit board. "Dad, look how big it is," he whispered, his voice filled with the kind of awe that made Jack grateful they'd made this trip, regardless of whatever complications might arise. Jack felt his own breath catch as the city revealed itself in layers, the downtown skyline reaching toward the mountains, the endless grid of streets and neighborhoods, the distant glimmer of ocean that promised adventures his son had only imagined. This was the world Ariel Blake moved through every day, a place where decisions affected millions of people and where the scale of everything dwarfed the intimate community life of Cedar Creek. Ariel was waiting for them at the small private airport, leaning against a modest SUV that looked almost ordinary compared to the Ferrari they'd first seen her driving. She'd dressed simply jeans and a soft blue sweater that brought out her accent. Jack was struck again by how different she seemed from the polished businesswoman he'd seen in magazine photos during his internet research. "Max," she called out as they approached, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "How was your first airplane ride?" "It was amazing," Max replied, his shyness evaporating in the face of her obvious interest. "The pilot let me see the cockpit, and Sarah, that's the flight attendant, showed me how they make the food up in the air." "That sounds like the perfect way to travel," Ariel said, then turned to Jack with a smile that seemed slightly nervous. "I hope the flight was comfortable. I wasn't sure what to expect from a commercial airline with such short notice." "It was more than comfortable," Jack replied, meaning it. "Thank you for arranging everything so thoughtfully." The drive to Ariel's house took them through neighborhoods that showcased the vast economic diversity of Los Angeles, from modest apartment complexes to gated estates that spoke of wealth beyond Jack's experience. Max provided running commentary on everything he saw, asking questions about the palm trees and the architecture and the people walking dogs that looked like they'd been professionally groomed. Ariel answered each question with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed sharing knowledge, and Jack found himself watching her profile as she drove, noting the way her expression softened when she talked to Max. There was something about his son that seemed to bring out a gentler side of her personality, a warmth that he suspected she rarely allowed herself to show in her professional life. "I thought we could start with the beach this afternoon," Ariel said as they turned into a neighborhood where the houses were hidden behind high walls and elaborate landscaping. "It's only about 20 minutes from my place, and the weather's perfect for walking on the sand." "I've never seen the ocean," Max admitted, his excitement building as they got closer to their destination. "Dad showed me pictures, but he says it's different when you can actually see how big it is." "Your dad is right," Ariel agreed. Pictures can't capture the sound of the waves or the smell of the salt air or the way the horizon seems to go on forever. Jack felt something tighten in his chest at the easy way she talked to Max, the natural rapport that seemed to exist between them despite their vastly different backgrounds. His son had always been good at connecting with adults, but there was something special about the way he responded to Ariel's attention, as if he recognized in her someone who understood what it felt like to be lonely, despite being surrounded by people. Ariel's house, when they finally reached it, was both more and less impressive than Jack had expected. The property was clearly valuable, situated in what was obviously an exclusive neighborhood, with views of both the city and the ocean, but the house itself felt more like a home than a showplace. The architecture was modern but warm, with large windows that let in natural light and spaces that seemed designed for comfortable living rather than entertaining. "I know it's probably bigger than what you're used to," Ariel said as she showed them to the guest room where they'd be staying. "But I wanted you to be comfortable. Max, this room has a balcony that overlooks the pool, and there's a telescope on the nightstand if you want to look at the stars tonight." Max's eyes went wide at the mention of a telescope, and Jack made a mental note to wake up early enough to help his son explore the night sky from this new vantage point. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful detail that showed Ariel had put genuine consideration into making their visit special. "The beach?" Max asked hopefully, already changed into the swimming trunks Jack had packed on the assumption that they might encounter some kind of water during their Los Angeles adventure. "The beach," Ariel confirmed, and Jack was touched by the genuine enthusiasm in her voice. The drive to the ocean took them through more neighborhoods that showcased the complexity of the city strip malls and luxury shopping districts. Fast food restaurants and establishments that looked like they required reservations months in advance. Max absorbed it all with the wide-eyed interest of someone seeing a completely different way of life for the first time. But it was the ocean itself that silenced him completely. When they parked and walked over the last small dune that blocked their view of the water, Max stopped so suddenly that Jack nearly bumped into him from behind. The Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface catching the afternoon sun in millions of small mirrors, waves rolling onto the sand with the kind of rhythmic persistence that made the problems of land-based life seem temporarily irrelevant. "It's so big," Max whispered, his voice filled with the kind of wonder that reminded Jack why children saw magic in the world that adults had learned to take for granted. "It is," Ariel agreed, kneeling beside him in the sand, "and this is just a tiny piece of it. The ocean connects to every continent, touches shores thousands of miles away, where completely different people are watching the same water we're looking at right now." Max considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all new concepts, then suddenly broke into a run toward the water's edge, his earlier shyness completely forgotten in the face of such an overwhelming natural wonder. Jack started to follow, but Ariel caught his arm gently. "Let him explore," she said. "The waves aren't too big today, and I can see him from here." They settled onto a piece of driftwood that had been polished smooth by years of salt water and sun, watching Max dance back and forth with the advancing and retreating waves, his laughter carrying on the ocean breeze like the sound of pure joy made audible. "Thank you," Jack said, meaning it more deeply than he could easily express. Not just for the trip, but for this, for caring enough to make it special for him. Ariel was quiet for a moment, her eyes following Max's adventures at the water's edge. "I can't remember the last time I did something just because it might make someone happy," she said finally. "Everything in my life has become so calculated, so focused on outcomes and strategic objectives. Watching Max discover the ocean, it reminds me that some of the best things in life are just about wonder and joy and being present in the moment." Jack studied her profile, noting the way the ocean breeze had loosened her carefully styled hair and brought color to her cheeks. She looked younger like this, more relaxed, as if being away from her usual environment had allowed her to drop some of the protective armor she wore in her professional life. "What was it like growing up?" he asked, curious about the path that had led her to such enormous success at such a young age. "Lonely," Ariel replied without hesitation. "My father was brilliant and driven, and he loved me completely, but his work consumed most of his attention. I learned early that the way to connect with him was to be interested in what he was building, to understand the business, and share his passion for innovation. She paused, watching Max attempt to build a sandcastle, only to have each wave knock down his progress. I was good at it, better than good, actually. I understood the technology and the strategy and the vision for how we could change the world. But somewhere along the way, I lost track of why any of it mattered beyond the metrics and the market share and the quarterly projections. "And now?" Jack prompted. "Now, I have everything my father dreamed of building, and I can't shake the feeling that he'd be disappointed in what it's become, or maybe what I've become in the process of building it." There was a vulnerability in her voice that reminded Jack of the letter she'd written, the honesty that had first made him want to know her better. In her world of calculated interactions and strategic relationships, the ability to admit uncertainty or dissatisfaction probably felt like a dangerous luxury. "Your father would be proud," Jack said with quiet certainty, "not because of the money or the success, but because you're asking the right questions. Because you still care about whether what you're building actually matters." Max came running back to them, his shoes full of sand and his face bright with discovery. "Dad, Ariel, you have to come see this tide pool. There are tiny crabs and sea anemones and fish that are almost invisible." They spent the next hour exploring the rocky areas where low tide had revealed miniature ecosystems, with Max providing enthusiastic narration about each creature they discovered. Ariel proved to be an eager student, asking questions about marine biology that Max answered with the authority of someone who'd clearly been studying ocean life in preparation for their trip. "How did you know so much about tide pools?" Jack asked his son as they finally headed back toward the car. "I checked out books from the library after you told me we were coming to see the ocean," Max explained matter-of-factly. "I wanted to be ready for whatever we might find." Jack felt his chest tighten with pride and love for this remarkable boy who approached every new experience with such thorough preparation and open-hearted enthusiasm. Sarah would have been so proud of the young man Max was becoming, the way he combined careful learning with fearless exploration. "That's exactly what a good scientist does," Ariel told Max approvingly. "Research first, then observe, then ask new questions based on what you discover." The drive back to Ariel's house took them through the golden hour of late afternoon, when the Los Angeles light transformed even the most ordinary neighborhood into something that looked like it belonged in a movie. Max had grown quiet in the back seat, processing all the new experiences of the day, occasionally asking questions about the city or making observations about the differences between life here and in Cedar Creek. "It's louder here," he noted as they waited at a traffic light. "Not bad loud, just more sounds all happening at the same time." "That's a good way to describe it," Ariel agreed. "Sometimes I miss the quiet. When I was growing up, we lived in a neighborhood where you could hear individual birds singing, not just the general noise of a million people all living close together." "Do you ever think about moving somewhere quieter?" Jack asked, genuinely curious about whether someone with her wealth and success ever considered choosing a simpler life. "Sometimes," Ariel admitted, "but then I think about all the people who depend on the company, all the projects we're working on that might actually make the world better, and it feels selfish to walk away just because I'm tired of the complexity." It was exactly the kind of answer Jack would have expected from someone raised to see business success as a form of service, but he heard something else in her voice, a weariness that suggested the weight of responsibility had become heavier than she'd expected when she'd first inherited her father's empire. That evening, they ordered pizza and ate it on Ariel's back patio, watching the city lights come alive as darkness settled over Los Angeles. Max used the telescope to examine the moon, and the few stars bright enough to compete with the urban lighting, while Jack and Ariel talked about everything from small-town life to the challenges of raising children, to the way grief changed your perspective on what actually mattered. "I keep thinking about what you wrote in your letter," Jack said during a quiet moment when Max was focused on adjusting the telescope's focus. "About feeling isolated despite being surrounded by people. I know something about that." Ariel looked at him with interest. Because of losing your wife? Partly, Jack agreed, but also because people see me as Max's father, or the widower, or Sarah's husband, more than they see me as just Jack. Sometimes I feel like I've become more of a role than a person, you know? I do know, Ariel said softly. It's like everyone has decided who you are based on your circumstances, and anything that doesn't fit that definition gets ignored or dismissed. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in thoughts about identity and expectation, and the challenge of remaining authentic when the world insisted on reducing you to easily understood categories. Jack found himself studying Ariel's face in the soft patio lighting, noting the way her expression had relaxed throughout the day. How she seemed more like the vulnerable woman who'd written him a letter and less like the polished executive from the magazine photos. "Dad, can you help me see Saturn?" Max called from his position behind the telescope. "Ariel said it might be visible tonight if we look in the right direction." Jack rose to help his son, but not before catching Ariel's smile at Max's casual use of her first name. The boy had moved past any awkwardness about their different worlds, accepting her friendship with the uncomplicated trust that children offered to adults who treated them with genuine respect and interest. As Jack helped Max locate Saturn's distinctive rings through the telescope, he was acutely aware of Ariel watching them work together, her expression soft with something that looked like longing. He wondered if she'd ever imagined having a family of her own, whether the demands of her career had required her to set aside those possibilities, or if she'd simply never met someone who could see past her wealth and success to the person underneath. "There!" Max exclaimed as the planet came into focus. "I can see the rings. They're real." "They're real," Ariel confirmed, moving to look through the telescope herself. "And they're made of ice and rock particles that have been orbiting Saturn for millions of years." "That's longer than people have even existed," Max observed with the matter-of-fact acceptance of vast timescales that children somehow managed better than adults. "Much longer," Ariel agreed. "It makes you think about how small our problems are compared to the universe, doesn't it?" Jack found himself thinking about his own small problems, the anxiety about whether this trip was wise, the guilt about feeling attracted to someone other than Sarah, the uncertainty about what kind of future he wanted to build for himself and Max. Set against the backdrop of Saturn's ancient rings and the vast Pacific Ocean they'd explored that afternoon, those concerns felt both more manageable and more clearly defined. When Max finally started yawning, Jack helped him get ready for bed in the beautiful guest room that Ariel had prepared, with such thoughtful attention to detail. As he tucked his son under covers that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, Max looked up at him with sleepy contentment. "This is the best day ever, Dad," he said with the absolute conviction that 8-year-olds brought to their superlatives. "Ariel is really nice, and she knows so much about everything." "She is nice," Jack agreed, smoothing Max's hair back from his forehead. "Are you glad we came?" "Really glad," Max confirmed, already half asleep. "I think Mom would like her." The simple observation hit Jack with unexpected force, mostly because he suspected Max was right. Sarah would have appreciated Ariel's genuine interest in Max's enthusiasms, her ability to share knowledge without condescension, her obvious pleasure in simple discoveries like tide pools and telescope views. More than that, Sarah would have recognized the loneliness beneath Ariel's success, and probably would have been plotting ways to help her find more authentic connections in her life. When Jack returned to the patio, he found Ariel still sitting in the same chair, staring out at the city lights with an expression that suggested she was processing the day's experiences as much as he was. "He's a remarkable boy," she said as Jack settled back into his chair. "The way he approaches everything with such genuine curiosity and enthusiasm, it's like he hasn't learned to be cynical yet." "I hope he never does," Jack replied. "Although I suppose some cynicism is probably necessary for navigating the world as an adult." "Maybe," Ariel said thoughtfully, "or maybe the world would be better if more adults kept some of that openness and wonder that Max has. I know I felt more alive today, watching him discover the ocean, than I have in months of board meetings and strategic planning sessions." Jack found himself studying her face in the soft lighting, noting the way her guard had come down throughout the day, how she seemed more relaxed and genuine than he'd seen her before. The attraction he'd been trying to ignore was becoming harder to dismiss, complicated by growing admiration for her character and genuine affection for the way she'd treated Max. "What happens when we go back to Cedar Creek?" he asked, not entirely sure what he was really asking. Ariel met his eyes directly, and Jack saw vulnerability there that reminded him of her letter, of the lonely woman who'd reached out to thank a stranger for simple kindness. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't thought beyond this weekend, beyond wanting to share something good with you and Max, but I know I don't want this to be the end of getting to know both of you." The honesty of her answer, and the hope it implied, made Jack's chest tight with possibilities he wasn't sure he was ready to consider. But as he looked at this remarkable woman who'd opened her home and heart to them, who'd made his son feel special and welcomed, he realized that wanting something more than the safe predictability of his carefully controlled life might not be a betrayal of Sarah's memory, but rather a step toward the kind of full engagement with life that she'd always encouraged him to embrace. "I'd like that too," he said, and meant it more than he'd expected when the words left his mouth. They sat in comfortable silence after that, each lost in thoughts about possibility and risk, and the courage required to reach for something beyond the familiar boundaries of their respective worlds. Around them, Los Angeles hummed with the constant energy of millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles, but on Ariel's quiet patio, Jack felt the rare peace that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment in time. The anonymous letter arrived at Ariel's house on Sunday morning, slipped under the front door sometime during the early hours, while Jack and Max were still sleeping, and Ariel was enjoying her first cup of coffee in the peaceful garden that overlooked the city. The envelope was plain white, her name typed rather than handwritten, with no return address or other identifying marks. Inside, the message was brief and chilling. "Your new friends from Cedar Creek don't know what kind of person you really are. Stop this charade before someone gets hurt. You've destroyed enough lives already." Ariel's hands trembled slightly as she read the words again, trying to understand who might have sent such a message and what they might be referring to. The reference to destroyed lives felt like a knife turning in an old wound, bringing back memories she'd spent years trying to process and move beyond. She was still staring at the letter when Jack appeared on the patio, coffee cup in hand, and his hair still mussed from sleep. He looked relaxed, in a way that made her chest tight with Gilther, was a man who'd brought his son into her world, trusting that she was the lonely but basically decent person her letter had suggested, not knowing about the darker aspects of her business history that someone obviously wanted to expose. "Good morning," Jack said, settling into the chair beside her, with the easy familiarity that had developed over their weekend together. "Max is still sleeping, but I could hear him talking to himself about tide pools and telescopes, so I think yesterday made quite an impression." "Good morning," Ariel replied, quickly folding the letter and slipping it into her pocket. "I was thinking we could take him to the Science Museum today, if that sounds interesting. They have an interactive exhibit about space exploration that might appeal to a budding scientist." Jack smiled, the expression transforming his face in ways that made Ariel's heart skip, despite the anxiety created by the threatening letter. "He'd love that. Although I have to warn you, he might want to explain everything to you, whether you already know about it or not." "I'm looking forward to it," Ariel said, and meant it despite the growing unease she felt about involving Jack and Max in whatever vendetta the letter writer was pursuing. They spent the morning at the California Science Center, where Max's enthusiasm for hands-on learning proved infectious to both adults. Ariel found herself genuinely fascinated by exhibits she might normally have rushed through, seeing them fresh through Max's eyes as he asked questions and made connections between different concepts. Jack proved to be a patient and encouraging father, guiding Max's exploration without dominating it, asking questions that helped his son think more deeply about what he was observing. Watching them together, Ariel felt a sharp longing for the kind of family dynamic she'd never experienced, the easy partnership between parent and child, the shared joy and discovery, the sense of belonging to something larger than individual ambition. It was while Max was absorbed in a robotics demonstration that Jack's phone rang with a call from Pete back in Cedar Creek. Ariel could only hear Jack's side of the conversation, but his expression grew increasingly serious as Pete apparently shared news from home. "What do you mean, reporters?" Jack asked, his voice tight with concern. "How many? Since when?" Ariel felt her stomach drop as she realized that whatever breathing room they'd gained by leaving Cedar Creek had apparently evaporated while they were gone. The anonymous letter suddenly seemed less like an isolated threat and more like the opening move in a coordinated campaign to destroy the fragile connection she'd built with Jack and Max. "We'll be home tonight," Jack said into the phone. "Don't talk to any of them, and if they won't leave the shop alone, call Sheriff Martinez." After ending the call, Jack turned to Ariel with an expression that mixed confusion with growing concern. "Pete says there are reporters camped outside my garage, asking questions about our relationship and whether I'm planning to take you up on your marriage challenge. Apparently someone told them we were in Los Angeles together." Ariel felt the familiar weight of media scrutiny settling around her shoulders like a heavy coat she could never quite shed. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it completely. "I hoped that keeping things private would be enough, but sometimes the attention finds you anyway." "Who would have told them we were here?" Jack asked, and Ariel could hear the beginning of suspicion in his voice, the reasonable question of whether she'd somehow orchestrated the publicity despite her promises to the contrary. Before she could answer, her own phone rang with a call from Marcus Webb, one of her business partners and someone she'd specifically asked not to be disturbed by during the weekend. The timing felt ominous, and Ariel's anxiety ratcheted higher as she accepted the call. "Ariel, we need to talk immediately," Marcus said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that usually preceded major crises. "Where are you right now?" "I'm at a museum with friends," Ariel replied carefully, aware that Jack was listening to every word and probably drawing conclusions about the level of calculation involved in their supposedly spontaneous weekend. "Well, you need to get somewhere private where we can discuss the situation that's developing," Marcus continued. "Patricia and I have been fielding calls all morning from investors and board members who are concerned about the optics of your current relationship." "What optics?" Ariel asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. "Photos of you and your mechanic friend walking on the beach, having dinner, looking very much like a couple. Someone's been following you, documenting your weekend, and now there are questions about whether this is a genuine relationship or some kind of elaborate publicity stunt." Ariel felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the implications of what Marcus was telling her. Someone had been watching them during their private moments, their conversation on the beach, their quiet dinner, their telescope session on the patio, and had turned those intimate moments into content for public consumption. "I need to call you back," she said, ending the conversation before Marcus could object. Jack was studying her expression with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was beginning to understand that their weekend together had been far less private than either of them had believed. "Someone's been taking pictures of us?" he asked quietly. "It seems that way," Ariel confirmed, feeling sick about what this meant for Jack and Max's safety and privacy. "I'm so sorry. I never intended for any of this to happen." Max returned from the robotics demonstration at that moment, his face bright with excitement about programmable machines and artificial intelligence, completely unaware that his innocent weekend adventure had become the subject of media speculation and strategic calculation. "Can we see the space shuttle exhibit now?" he asked, looking between the two adults and noting their serious expressions. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Jack said automatically, the kind of protective lie that parents told to shield their children from adult complications. "But we might need to head home a little earlier than planned." The drive back to Ariel's house was quiet. with Max reading a book about space exploration he'd purchased at the museum gift shop, while Jack and Ariel sat lost in their respective thoughts about how quickly their private connection had become public property. Once Max was settled in the garden, with his new book and a snack, Ariel called Marcus back to get the full scope of whatever crisis was developing around their relationship. "The photos are already being picked up by entertainment news outlets," Marcus explained, with the clinical detachment he brought to all business crises. "You walking on the beach holding hands, having what looks like an intimate dinner conversation, the boy calling you by your first name like you're already family." "We weren't holding hands," Ariel protested, though she realized that whether or not the photos accurately represented reality was less important than how they would be interpreted by people looking for evidence of romance or deception. "That's not how it looks in the pictures," Marcus replied. "And frankly, accurate or not, this creates an opportunity that we'd be foolish not to capitalize on." "What kind of opportunity?" Ariel asked, though she was beginning to suspect where this conversation was headed. "The Blake Marriage Challenge has generated more organic engagement than any marketing campaign we've run in the past 5 years," Marcus said, his excitement building as he outlined the strategic possibilities. "If we position this as the culmination of that challenge's successful tech heiress finds love with salt-of-the-earth mechanic, we could leverage it into a major product launch or brand partnership." "Absolutely not," Ariel said firmly. "This is not a marketing opportunity. These are real people with real lives, not characters in some corporate fairy tale." "But think about the narrative potential." Patricia's voice joined the conversation, apparently having been listening on speaker. "Modern woman with everything discovers that love can't be bought, finds happiness with someone who values her for who she is rather than what she owns. It's exactly the kind of authentic story that consumers are craving." Ariel felt something cold and angry settling in her chest as she listened to her business partners reduce her growing feelings for Jack and her genuine affection for Max to marketing concepts and strategic messaging opportunities. "I'm ending this conversation," she said, "and if either of you releases any statements or pursues any marketing initiatives related to my personal life, you'll be hearing from my lawyers." After hanging up, Ariel sat in her kitchen, staring at the anonymous letter she'd received that morning, beginning to understand the full scope of the situation she'd inadvertently created. Someone was threatening to expose unspecified aspects of her past. Photographers had been documenting her private moments with Jack and Max, and her own business partners were scheming to turn her personal life into a profit center. Jack appeared in the doorway, his expression serious and slightly distant in a way that made Ariel's chest tight, with the fear that she was losing his trust, just as she was beginning to understand how much it meant to her. "We need to talk," he said, and the formal tone in his voice confirmed her worst fears about how he was interpreting the morning's revelations. They settled in her living room, the space that had felt so comfortable and welcoming during their quiet evening together, now feeling formal and charged with tension. "Tell me the truth," Jack said without preamble. "Is any of this real, or am I just the latest prop in some elaborate performance?" The question hit Ariel like a physical blow, both because she understood why he might ask it and because it suggested that everything they'd shared over the weekend had been recontextualized in his mind as potential manipulation. "It's real," she said, meaning it completely. "Everything I felt this weekend, everything I wrote in my letter, my feelings for you and Max, all of it is real." "But you knew this would happen," Jack pressed. "The reporters, the photographers, the attention. You had to know that spending time with me would create exactly this kind of situation." Ariel wanted to deny it, but honesty forced her to acknowledge the partial truth in his accusation. "I hoped it wouldn't," she said carefully. "I wanted to believe that we could have something private, that my world wouldn't automatically contaminate whatever we might build together. But you're right that I should have been more realistic about the risks." Jack studied her face with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was trying to decide whether to believe her, whether to trust his own instincts about her character or the evidence that suggested she might be more calculating than he'd realized. "There's something else," Ariel said, pulling the anonymous letter from her pocket and handing it to Jack. "Someone left this at my house this morning." Jack read the letter twice, his expression growing more troubled with each reading. "What lives are they talking about? What don't we know about you?" Ariel took a deep breath, realizing that the conversation she'd been dreading was about to become unavoidable. 5 years ago, Blake Technologies acquired a smaller company that was developing revolutionary battery technology. The acquisition was completely legal and above board, but it put 300 people out of work when we consolidated operations. She paused, remembering the faces of the employees who'd been laid off, the families whose lives had been disrupted by decisions made in conference rooms where human costs were reduced to numerical abstractions. One of those employees was a man named Chen, a brilliant engineer who'd put everything he had into developing the technology we acquired. After the layoff, he couldn't find comparable work, lost his house, went through a bitter divorce. 6 months later, he committed suicide. Jack's expression remained carefully neutral, but Ariel could see him processing the implications of what she'd told him, weighing her business decisions against his understanding of her character. "His family blamed Blake Technologies for his death," she continued. "They were probably right to. We could have found ways to keep more people employed, could have been more thoughtful about the human impact of our decisions. But we were focused on market efficiency and competitive advantage, and we treated people like expendable resources." "And you think someone from his family sent this letter?" Jack asked. "I don't know," Ariel admitted. "But Chen had a teenage daughter who made some very public statements about corporate responsibility and accountability after her father's death. If she's grown up nursing a grudge against me personally, she might see my relationship with you and Max as an opportunity to expose what she sees as my hypocrisy." The conversation was interrupted by Max calling from the garden, asking if they could look at Saturn through the telescope one more time before leaving Los Angeles. The innocent request, delivered with such genuine enthusiasm, highlighted the stakes of whatever decisions Jack and Ariel made about their future. "I need to think about this," Jack said finally, "about what it means for Max to be involved in something that includes anonymous threats and business vendettas and photographers documenting our private moments." Ariel nodded, understanding completely, even as her heart broke a little at the thought of losing the connection they'd built over the weekend. "I understand, and I'm sorry for all of it. You and Max deserved better than to be dragged into the complications of my world." As Jack went to help Max with the telescope, Ariel sat alone in her living room, staring at the anonymous letter and feeling the familiar weight of isolation settling around her shoulders. She'd found something real and valuable with Jack and Max, had experienced the kind of authentic connection she'd been craving for years, only to watch it threatened by the very success and notoriety that had made her valuable to others. The cruelest irony was that the anonymous letter writer was probably right about one thing. Jack and Max didn't know what kind of person she really was. Not because she was actively deceptive, but because the demands of her position had required her to make choices that good people like them would probably find morally questionable. As she listened to Max's excited questions about planetary rings and stellar distances, Ariel realized that she had a choice to make: retreat back into the safe isolation of her carefully controlled life, or fight for the possibility of something better, even if it meant confronting the darker aspects of her past and the people who wanted to use those aspects against her. The decision, she knew, would determine not just her own future, but whether Jack and Max would be able to build the kind of life that honored both their simple values and their capacity for growth and adventure. Either way, she was no longer willing to let other people's agendas determine the course of her personal relationships. It was time, she realized, to stop being a passive victim of her own success and start fighting for what actually mattered. The flight back to Cedar Creek felt longer than the journey out, weighted down by unspoken concerns and the careful politeness that people used when they were trying not to say things that might make a difficult situation worse. Max, exhausted by 2 days of new experiences and sensing the tension between the adults, fell asleep against Jack's shoulder before they'd even reached cruising altitude. Jack spent most of the flight staring out the window at the landscape passing below, processing everything that had happened over the weekend and trying to decide what it meant for his carefully constructed life. The anonymous threat, the photographs taken without their knowledge, the revelation about Ariel's role in events that had led to someone's death, all of it felt like complications he wasn't equipped to handle. But underneath his concern about the external pressures was a deeper confusion about his own feelings. Despite everything that had been revealed about Ariel's world and its potential dangers, he couldn't shake the memory of her genuine delight when Max's volcano had erupted on the roadside, or the vulnerability in her voice when she'd talked about feeling isolated despite her success. The woman who'd knelt in the dust to watch an 8-year-old science project, who'd spent patient hours answering questions about tide pools and telescopes, who'd written such a heartfelt letter about the value of simple human kindness, that person felt real in ways that transcended whatever business decisions she'd made or threats she might be facing from people who wanted to punish her for past actions. Ariel sat across the aisle, ostensibly reading business documents on her tablet, but actually stealing glances at Jack and Max when she thought they weren't looking. The careful distance Jack had maintained since their conversation about the anonymous letter felt like a physical weight in her chest, a reminder of how quickly trust could be damaged and how difficult it was to rebuild once doubts had been planted. She'd spent years learning to compartmentalize her personal feelings in service of business objectives, but watching Jack's protective instincts engage around Max made her realize how much she wanted to be someone he could trust with his son's safety and happiness. The possibility that her world might be too dangerous or complicated for them to navigate together felt like losing something precious before she'd fully understood its value. When they landed at the small regional airport that served Cedar Creek, Pete was waiting for them in his ancient pickup truck, his expression grim in a way that suggested the media attention in their absence had been worse than his phone call had indicated. "They're still camped out around your shop," Pete told Jack as they loaded their luggage into the truck bed. "Been there since Friday, asking questions about your relationship with Miss Blake here, whether you're planning to get married, what kind of man would leave his business to go gallivanting with a billionaire." Jack felt his jaw tighten at the description of their weekend as gallivanting, the casual dismissal of what had been genuine connection and shared discovery. "How many reporters?" "Started with 2, now there's maybe 6 or 7. Got their cameras and their satellite dishes, and their complete disregard for the concept of private property." Pete replied with the disgust of someone who valued small-town courtesy and found media attention inherently distasteful. Max stirred from his sleep as they drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Creek, looking around with the slight disorientation that came from returning to a place that suddenly seemed smaller and quieter than you remembered. "Are we home, Dad?" "We're home," Jack confirmed, though he wasn't sure yet what kind of home they were returning to. Whether the simple life he'd built would survive the media scrutiny that had apparently descended on their town in their absence. As they approached Jack's garage, they could see the cluster of news vans and reporters that Pete had described, their equipment and cameras trained on the modest building as if it might reveal secrets worth broadcasting to the world. Several reporters noticed Pete's truck and started moving in their direction, cameras rising and voices calling out questions that Jack couldn't quite make out through the closed windows. "Drive past," Jack told Pete. "Take us to your place. I don't want Max dealing with this right now." Pete nodded and continued down the street without slowing, but not before Jack saw one of the reporters pointing at their truck and speaking urgently into a phone. Within minutes, they'd probably figure out where Pete lived and bring their cameras and questions to his front yard as well. "Why are all those people at your shop, Dad?" Max asked, his voice carrying the first note of anxiety Jack had heard from him since their adventure began. "They're reporters," Jack explained carefully. "They want to ask questions about our trip to Los Angeles and about Ariel." "What kind of questions?" Max pressed, and Jack could see him trying to understand why anyone would be interested in their weekend at the beach and the Science Museum. Questions about whether we're going to be friends with Ariel, whether she might visit us here, things like that, Jack said, trying to keep his explanation simple without lying about the seriousness of the situation. Max considered this information with the thoughtful expression he brought to complex problems. Are we going to be friends with her? It was exactly the question Jack had been avoiding, asking himself, the one that required him to weigh his growing feelings for Ariel against his responsibility to protect Max from the complications and potential dangers that seemed to follow her wherever she went. I don't know yet, Jack said honestly. It's complicated. Pete's small house sat on a quiet side street that had apparently escaped the reporter's attention, at least for the moment. But as they unloaded their luggage and settled in Pete's living room, Jack's phone began ringing with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, probably journalists who'd somehow obtained his contact information and wanted quotes about his relationship with Ariel Blake. Don't answer any of them, Pete advised, settling into his favorite armchair with a cup of coffee and the grim satisfaction of someone who'd been predicting exactly this kind of chaos. Nothing good ever comes from talking to reporters when they're in a feeding frenzy. Ariel had been unusually quiet since leaving the airport, checking her own phone periodically and responding to what appeared to be urgent messages with increasingly terse replies. Finally, she looked up from her screen with an expression that mixed determination with apprehension. I need to go back to Los Angeles tonight, she announced. My legal team wants to meet first thing tomorrow morning to discuss damage control strategies and potential responses to whatever information the letter writer might be planning to release. Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach at the clinical language she was using, the return to business terminology that reminded him of the gulf between their worlds. Damage control strategies for what? For the David Chen situation, primarily. Ariel replied, her voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested she was fighting to maintain professional composure. If his daughter or someone else from his family is behind the anonymous threats, they probably have access to internal company documents, employee testimony, maybe even recorded conversations that could be taken out of context. She paused, meeting Jack's eyes directly. I want you to know that everything I told you about the acquisition was true. We made legal decisions that had terrible human consequences, and I've carried the weight of that for 5 years. But if someone wants to paint me as a heartless corporate villain who destroys families for profit, they'll probably be able to find enough evidence to make a compelling case. Max was listening to this conversation with the focused attention he brought to adult discussions that seemed important but not entirely comprehensible. Is someone trying to hurt Ariel? He asked, his voice carrying genuine concern for someone he'd come to care about over their weekend together. Not physically, Jack assured him quickly, but sometimes people try to hurt others by saying bad things about them, especially when those people are famous or important. That's not fair, Max declared, with the absolute moral clarity that 8-year-olds brought to questions of justice. Ariel is nice. She let me use her telescope and she knew all about tide pools, and she didn't get mad when I got sand in her car. The simple defense, delivered with such conviction, made Ariel's eyes bright with unshed tears. Here was someone who judged her entirely on how she'd treated him and his father, without any consideration of corporate politics or strategic business decisions or the complicated moral calculations that governed adult interactions. Thank you, Max, she said softly. That means more to me than you probably realize. Jack's phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Martinez, asking him to call when he had a chance to discuss the media situation and whether any laws were being broken by the reporters camping outside his business. The involvement of law enforcement, even in a supportive capacity, emphasized how far their simple weekend adventure had spiraled beyond anyone's control. I should probably stay and deal with this, Jack said, meaning both the immediate media circus and the larger question of what he wanted his and Max's relationship with Ariel to look like going forward. I understand, Ariel replied, though Jack could hear disappointment in her voice beneath the careful neutrality. But I want you to know that whatever happens with the legal situation, whatever gets revealed or distorted about my past, My feelings about this weekend and about both of you haven't changed." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Max with a smile that managed to be both sad and hopeful. "I wrote you a letter about all the things we discovered together, the tide pools, the space shuttle, Saturn's rings, so you can remember our adventure even if things get complicated for the grown-ups." Max accepted the letter with the reverence he reserved for truly important documents, carefully unfolding it to read Ariel's handwriting. Jack could see his son's face light up as he recognized references to their shared experiences, the personal details that proved someone had been paying attention to what mattered to him. "Will you come back and visit us?" Max asked, his voice carrying the kind of hope that made adult complications feel both more urgent and more manageable. "I'd like to," Ariel said honestly, "but that might depend on whether your dad thinks it's safe for you to be friends with someone who attracts as much attention as I do." It was a fair question, one that required Jack to weigh his growing feelings for Ariel against his responsibility to protect Max from the media scrutiny and potential threats that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The anonymous letter had made it clear that someone viewed their relationship as an opportunity to attack Ariel's reputation, possibly by targeting the people she cared about. "We'll figure it out," Jack said, which wasn't really an answer but was the best he could offer, given the uncertainty of their situation. After Pete drove Ariel to the airport for her flight back to Los Angeles, Jack and Max settled into the guest bedroom that Pete had prepared for them, planning to stay there until the media attention around Jack's shop died down to manageable levels. Max read his letter from Ariel 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it on the nightstand beside his science fair trophy. "Dad, are you going to marry Ariel?" Max asked, as Jack tucked him into the unfamiliar bed. The question caught Jack off guard, both because he hadn't expected such directness from his 8-year-old son, and because it forced him to confront feelings he'd been carefully avoiding examining too closely. "Why do you ask?" Jack replied, buying time to figure out how to answer honestly without creating expectations that might not be fulfilled. "Because you smile different when you look at her," Max explained with the observational skills that often surprised adults. "Like how you used to smile when you looked at Mom before she got sick." The comparison hit Jack like a physical blow, mostly because Max was probably right. Somewhere over the weekend, his feelings for Ariel had moved beyond attraction or appreciation into something deeper and more complicated, something that felt like the beginning of love, despite all the practical reasons why such feelings were inconvenient and potentially dangerous. "It's complicated, son," Jack said finally. "Adults sometimes have feelings that don't fit easily into simple categories like friends, or married, or strangers." "But you like her," Max pressed, clearly unwilling to accept vague adult explanations when he could see the truth in his father's behavior. "I like her very much," Jack admitted, "but liking someone and being able to build a life with them are different things, especially when that person's world is so different from ours." Max considered this information with the seriousness he brought to all complex problems. Mom used to say that the best things in life were worth fighting for, even when they seemed impossible. The wisdom of Sarah's words, delivered through their son's clear voice, made Jack's chest tight with recognition. His wife had indeed believed that love was worth taking risks for, that the possibility of deep connection justified the vulnerability required to achieve it. She did say that, Jack agreed, and she was usually right about such things. "So maybe you should fight for Ariel," Max suggested with the logical directness that 8-year-olds brought to emotional problems. "And maybe she should fight for us too." After Max fell asleep, Jack sat in Pete's small living room, staring at his phone and thinking about the letter Ariel had written to his son. The gesture had been thoughtful and personal, focused entirely on Max's experience rather than any adult agenda or strategic consideration. It was exactly the kind of thing someone would do if they genuinely cared about a child's happiness, if they wanted to preserve his good memories, even if the adult relationship couldn't survive the complications surrounding it. His phone buzzed with a text message from Ariel, sent from the airport. "Thank you for the most wonderful weekend I've had in years. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that meeting you and Max has reminded me what it feels like to be genuinely happy. Take care of each other." The message was clearly meant as a goodbye, the kind of graceful exit that someone made when they decided that their presence in another person's life was causing more harm than good. But reading it, Jack felt a surge of something that might have been anger or determination, or simply the recognition that some things were too valuable to surrender without a fight. Over the next few days, the media attention intensified rather than fading as Jack had hoped. More reporters arrived in Cedar Creek, asking questions not just about his relationship with Ariel, but about his late wife, his business, his son's reaction to meeting a billionaire. The intrusion into their private lives felt like a violation that went far beyond reasonable public interest. But it was the arrival of David Chen's daughter, Jennifer, that transformed the situation from media nuisance into something potentially dangerous. She appeared at Pete's house on Wednesday evening, a young woman in her 20s with the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd come to Cedar Creek with a specific agenda. "I'm the one who sent the letter," she announced when Jack answered Pete's front door. "And I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of person you're getting involved with before you make any decisions about your future." Jack stepped outside and closed the door behind him, not wanting Max to overhear whatever accusations Jennifer Chen had come to make. "I'm listening." "Ariel Blake destroyed my family," Jennifer said, her voice carrying years of accumulated anger and grief. "Her company bought out my father's startup, laid off everyone who'd built the technology they wanted, and left 300 people without jobs or prospects. My father spent everything he had trying to fight their acquisition, lost our house when he couldn't find new work, and killed himself rather than face bankruptcy and divorce." The words carried the weight of lived trauma, the kind of pain that time hadn't healed, but had instead crystallized into a demand for justice, or at least acknowledgement. Jack could see why Jennifer Chen might view Ariel's apparent happiness as an affront to her father's memory. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jack said, meaning it completely. "But I'm not sure what you want me to do with this information. I want you to understand that she's not the lonely, misunderstood woman she's pretending to be," Jennifer replied. "She's someone who makes decisions based entirely on profit and market position, who treats people like disposable resources, who's probably calculating right now how to turn your relationship into some kind of marketing opportunity." It was an accusation that hit close to concerns Jack had already been wrestling with, the question of whether Ariel's interest in him and Max was genuine or somehow connected to the publicity surrounding her viral video. But Jennifer Chen's certainty felt too absolute, too eager to reduce a complex person to a simple villain. "Have you ever actually met her?" Jack asked. "Talk to her about your father's death or the acquisition?" "I don't need to meet her," Jennifer replied. "I've seen the internal documents, the emails where she and her partners discussed the human resource redundancies created by their acquisition. She never even tried to find alternatives that would have kept people employed. It was all about maximizing efficiency and minimizing costs." Jack found himself thinking about the vulnerable woman who'd written him such a heartfelt letter, who'd knelt in the dust to watch Max's volcano erupt, who'd spent patient hours answering an 8-year-old's questions about marine biology. Could the same person have made cold business decisions that destroyed families? "What do you want from me?" Jack asked finally. "I want you to walk away from her before she uses you and your son the same way she uses everyone else," Jennifer said. "And I want you to understand that if you don't, I'm prepared to release documents and recordings that will show the world exactly what kind of person Ariel Blake really is, regardless of who gets hurt in the process." After Jennifer Chen left, Jack sat on Pete's front porch, thinking about everything he'd learned over the past week about Ariel's loneliness and vulnerability, about her genuine affection for Max, about the business decisions that had led to David Chen's death, about the threats being made against anyone who got close to her. The situation felt impossible. How could he protect Max from the media attention and potential dangers that surrounded Ariel, while also honoring the connection they'd built? The possibility of love that felt real despite all the complications. How could he judge Ariel fairly when he'd seen evidence of both her capacity for kindness and her involvement in decisions that had terrible human consequences? His phone rang with a call from Ariel, the first direct contact they'd had since her departure 3 days earlier. Her voice sounded tired and stressed in ways that made him want to comfort her despite his own confusion about their situation. "Jack, I need to tell you something," she said without preamble. "Jennifer Chen contacted my legal team today. She's threatening to release what she claims is damaging information about Blake Technologies unless I publicly end our relationship and admit that the entire thing was a publicity stunt." "She was here tonight," Jack replied. "She told me about her father, about the acquisition, about the documents she claims to have." There was a long pause before Ariel spoke again. "Do you believe her version of events?" It was the question Jack had been dreading, the one that required him to choose between trust and suspicion, between the evidence of his own experience with Ariel and the accusations being made by someone who had every reason to want revenge. "I believe she's telling the truth about what happened to her father," Jack said carefully. "But I also believe that truth can be more complicated than any single perspective allows for." "I need to see you," Ariel said, her voice carrying an urgency that suggested she'd made some kind of decision. "There are things I need to tell you, things I should have said before, about my father's death and my role in the company and the choices I've made since then. You deserve the whole truth before you decide whether Max should be exposed to my world." "When?" Jack asked, realizing that he wanted to see her too, wanted to look in her eyes and judge for himself whether the woman he'd grown to care about was real or just another performance in a life full of strategic interactions. "Tomorrow," Ariel replied. "I'm flying back to Cedar Creek tomorrow morning, and I'm going to face whatever Jennifer Chen wants to throw at me. But first, I want to tell you everything, so you can make an informed decision about what kind of future, if any, we might have together." After ending the call, Jack realized that the conversation he'd been avoiding was about to become unavoidable. Tomorrow, he would learn whether the connection he'd felt with Ariel was strong enough to survive the full weight of truth about her past, her present, and the forces that were determined to keep them apart. The question was whether he was brave enough to fight for something that might be worth the risk, or whether protecting Max would require him to choose safety over the possibility of love. Ariel arrived in Cedar Creek Thursday morning, carrying a manila folder thick with documents and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested she'd spent the flight preparing for the most difficult conversation of her life. She'd traded her usual polished business attire for simple jeans and a sweater, as if she wanted to face Jack as the person she really was, rather than the corporate executive she'd trained herself to become. Jack met her at the small coffee shop on the edge of town, away from the reporters who were still camped around his garage and Pete's house. The choice of location felt significant neutral ground where they could talk honestly without the pressure of cameras or curious neighbors, where the conversation could unfold at its own pace without external interference. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, the manila folder resting on the table between them like evidence in a trial where they were both plaintiff and defendant. Ariel's hands were steady as she opened the folder, but Jack could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she was holding herself as if bracing for a blow. "These are the documents Jennifer Chen has," Ariel said without preamble, spreading papers across the small table. "Internal emails, acquisition reports, employee termination lists, financial projections that show exactly how much money Blake Technologies saved by eliminating what we called redundant personnel." Jack picked up one of the emails, scanning the clinical language that reduced human beings to line items in a corporate efficiency calculation. The tone was professional and detached, focused entirely on operational optimization without any visible consideration of the human cost involved in the decisions being made. "This email has your name on it," Jack observed, pointing to a message about consolidating research teams that would result in immediate termination for 47 employees. "It does," Ariel confirmed, her voice steady but quiet. "I wrote that email. I approved those terminations. I was 29 years old, recently promoted to head of strategic acquisitions, and absolutely convinced that I was making smart business decisions that would position the company for long-term success. She pulled out another document, this one, a financial analysis that showed the projected savings from the acquisition and subsequent layoffs. The numbers were significant millions of dollars in reduced labor costs that had presumably contributed to Blake Technologies' continued growth and profitability. David Chen was one of the engineers whose position was eliminated in the consolidation. Ariel continued, her voice taking on the measured tone of someone who'd rehearsed this confession but was still finding it difficult to deliver. He was 53 years old, had been with his company for 15 years, had 2 teenage children and a mortgage. He was struggling to pay even before he lost his job. Jack studied a photograph that had been included in the file. David Chen at a company picnic, smiling beside what was presumably his family. He looked like the kind of man Jack might have been friends with, someone who worked hard and loved his children, and probably never imagined that his life's work could be eliminated by someone young enough to be his daughter. "Did you know about his personal situation when you made the decision?" Jack asked. Ariel shook her head. "I knew the statistics: average age of employees being terminated, average tenure, estimated time to find comparable employment based on industry data. But I didn't know about individual circumstances, and I deliberately avoided learning them because I thought it would make me less objective in my decision-making." The honesty of her admission was both devastating and somehow redemptive. She wasn't trying to excuse her actions or shift responsibility to others, but rather acknowledging the full weight of decisions that had seemed rational in the abstract but had destroyed real lives in practice. "When did you find out about his suicide?" Jack asked. 6 months later, when his daughter started protesting outside our corporate offices, Ariel replied. "She carried signs with his picture and details about our acquisition, demanding that we take responsibility for the human cost of our business practices." She pulled out a news clipping that showed a young Jennifer Chen holding a sign that read, "Corporate greed killed my father," while standing outside Blake Technologies' headquarters. The image was powerful and heartbreaking, a daughter's grief transformed into public protest against the system that had failed her family. "What did you do?" Jack asked. "Initially, nothing," Ariel admitted, her voice heavy with regret. "My legal team advised me not to engage with protesters, not to acknowledge any connection between our business decisions and individual tragedies, not to do anything that might suggest corporate liability for personal outcomes." She paused, staring down at the photograph of David Chen with his family. "But I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the fact that his life's work had been reduced to a line item in my efficiency calculations. I started researching everyone who'd been laid off in the acquisition, trying to understand what had happened to them afterward." Jack found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite his conflicted feelings about Ariel's role in the tragedy. There was something in her voice that suggested this wasn't just a business crisis she was managing, but a genuine reckoning with the moral implications of her actions. "Most of them eventually found other jobs," Ariel continued. "Some took early retirement, some relocated to different cities, some started their own consulting practices. But there were others, like David Chen, people who'd been with their companies so long that their skills were considered outdated, people who couldn't afford to relocate or retrain, people who fell through the cracks of an economy that treated workers as disposable resources." "How many?" Jack asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 12 people from that acquisition never found comparable employment," Ariel said quietly. 3 lost their homes, 2 went through divorces, attributed partly to financial stress, and 1 David Chen took his own life rather than face bankruptcy and the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. The numbers were clinical, but Jack could hear the weight they carried for Ariel, the way each statistic represented a failure of imagination and compassion that she'd been living with for 5 years. "I started a foundation," Ariel said, pulling out the final document from her folder, "the Chen Memorial Fund, dedicated to helping displaced workers transition to new careers." We've provided job training, relocation assistance, temporary income, support, everything I should have thought about before making the acquisition decisions that destroyed people's lives. Jack examined the foundation documents, noting the substantial financial commitment Ariel had made and the comprehensive services being provided to workers affected by corporate downsizing. It was clearly more than a token gesture or public relations exercise. It represented a systematic attempt to address the human cost of business decisions. "Does Jennifer Chen know about the foundation?" Jack asked. "She knows, but she doesn't consider it adequate compensation for her father's death," Ariel replied. "She wants me to publicly admit that Blake Technologies' business practices are fundamentally immoral, to restructure the company around worker protection rather than profit maximization, to essentially abandon the capitalist model that built our success." It was an impossible demand, one that would require Ariel to destroy the empire her father had built in order to atone for the collateral damage created by maintaining it. Jack could understand both Jennifer Chen's desire for justice and Ariel's inability to provide the kind of systemic change that would satisfy that desire. "What happens if you don't meet her demands?" Jack asked. "She releases everything, the emails, the financial projections, recorded conversations from board meetings where we discuss the human impact of our decisions with what will sound like callous indifference," Ariel explained. "The story becomes about corporate greed and moral bankruptcy, about a billionaire who destroys families for profit and then tries to buy redemption through charity." Jack could already imagine the headlines, the way Ariel's complex moral journey would be reduced to a simple narrative about wealth and privilege and the human cost of unchecked capitalism. The foundation and her genuine remorse would probably be dismissed as damage control rather than recognized as evidence of growth and accountability. "And what happens to us?" Jack asked, gesturing between them to indicate not just their romantic connection, but their friendship and the relationship Ariel had built with Max. "Jennifer Chen wants me to publicly state that our relationship was a publicity stunt, that I used you and Max to rehabilitate my image after the marriage challenge video went viral," Ariel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wants me to humiliate myself and destroy whatever trust we've built in order to protect you from the media attention that's been following us." The proposal was both cruel and strategically brilliant. It would give Jennifer Chen the public victory she sought, while also punishing Ariel in the most personal way possible, by forcing her to sacrifice the first genuine connection she'd found in years. "What if you refuse?" Jack asked. "Then she destroys us all," Ariel replied simply. "The documents get released. The media narrative becomes about corporate corruption and personal deception, and you and Max get caught in the crossfire of a public relations war that has nothing to do with who we really are or what we mean to each other." Jack sat back in his chair, processing the impossible choice Ariel was facing and its implications for all of them. Either she sacrificed their relationship to protect them from media scrutiny, or she fought for their connection and exposed them to the kind of public attention that could disrupt Max's life and destroy the simple peace they'd built in Cedar Creek. "There's something else," Ariel said, reaching across the table to take Jack's hand. "Something I need you to know before you make any decisions about our future." Her touch sent warmth up his arm, despite the serious nature of their conversation, a reminder of the physical and emotional connection that had developed between them over their weekend together. "I love you," she said simply. "I love the way you parent Max with such patience and wisdom, the way you fix things with your hands and your heart, the way you've built a life that's both simple and meaningful. I love that you see me as a person rather than a symbol, that you've never once asked me for anything beyond honesty and genuine connection." The confession hit Jack with unexpected force, not because he hadn't suspected her feelings, but because hearing them spoken aloud made the stakes of their situation suddenly real and urgent. "I love Max too," Ariel continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I love his curiosity and enthusiasm, the way he approaches every new experience with such open-hearted wonder. I love that he's growing up with your values, that he's learning to see the world as a place where kindness matters more than wealth or status. Jack felt his own emotions rising to meet hers, the admission he'd been avoiding because it complicated everything and made all their choices more difficult. "I love you too," he said, meaning it completely. "And that's what makes this so hard. Because I don't know how to protect Max from the chaos that seems to follow you, while also fighting for something that feels more real than anything I've experienced since Sarah died." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the table, each processing the weight of mutual confession and the impossible decision it made necessary. Around them, the coffee shop hummed with the ordinary life of a small-town conversations about weather and local news, the comfortable rhythms of people who'd known each other for years. "I have an idea," Ariel said finally, her voice carrying a note of determination that suggested she'd been thinking about this possibility throughout their conversation. "But it requires me to take a risk that could destroy everything I've spent my life building." Jack looked at her expectantly, wondering what kind of solution she might have found to their seemingly impossible situation. "What if I fight back?" Ariel asked. "What if I refuse to be blackmailed into sacrificing our relationship, refuse to let Jennifer Chen control my life with threats and ultimatums? What if I tell my own story, on my own terms, before she can twist it into something unrecognizable?" The proposal was both brave and terrifying, a decision to confront the worst aspects of her past rather than hide from them, to trust that honesty and accountability might be more powerful than the strategic damage control her advisors would probably recommend. That would mean admitting to everything Jennifer Chen wants to expose, Jack pointed out. Your role in the acquisitions, the human cost of your business decisions, the fact that your success was built partly on other people's suffering. Yes, Ariel agreed. But it would also mean telling the whole truth about the foundation, about the changes I've made since learning about David Chen's death, about my commitment to doing better going forward. It would mean trusting people to understand that moral growth is possible, that accountability doesn't require self-destruction. Jack found himself thinking about Max's simple wisdom from the night before, that the best things in life were worth fighting for, even when they seemed impossible. Maybe his son was right. Maybe Sarah had been right about the value of taking risks for love. Maybe the choice wasn't between safety and danger, but between fear and courage. "What would you need from me?" Jack asked, already knowing that his answer would determine not just their future, but the kind of man he wanted to be, the kind of example he wanted to set for his son about how to respond when something precious was threatened. Ariel's answer came without hesitation, as if she'd been thinking about this moment throughout their entire conversation. "I need you to stand beside me when I tell the truth. Not as my spokesperson or my defender, but as someone who knows who I really am, who's seen how I treat the people I care about, who can speak honestly about our relationship and what it means to both of us." Jack felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this was the moment when he would have to choose between the safe predictability of his carefully controlled life and the uncertain possibilities that came with loving someone whose world was far more complicated than his own. "What about Max?" he asked, voicing the concern that had been central to every decision he'd made since Sarah's death. "What about protecting him from media attention and public scrutiny and all the chaos that comes with your level of visibility?" "We include him in the conversation," Ariel said simply. "We explain what's happening in terms he can understand. We let him help decide how much he wants to be involved. And we make sure he knows that none of this changes how much we both love him or how committed we are to his happiness and security." It was a radically different approach than the protective secrecy Jack had been considering, one that trusted Max's resilience and judgment rather than trying to shield him from all difficult realities. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. What if his son was stronger and wiser than Jack had been giving him credit for? "When would you want to do this?" Jack asked, already feeling his resistance crumbling in the face of Ariel's courage and the growing realization that running away from their connection would be a betrayal of everything Sarah had taught him about facing life's challenges. "With honesty and hope." Today, Ariel replied, before Jennifer Chen can control the narrative, before my business partners can convince me to prioritize damage control over truth-telling, before I lose my nerve and decide that protecting my reputation is more important than fighting for us. The urgency in her voice was infectious, and Jack found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the implications of what he was agreeing to. In a few hours, they would be holding a press conference that would expose the most vulnerable aspects of their lives to public scrutiny and judgment. How? Jack asked, practical considerations beginning to assert themselves. Where? Who handles the logistics of something like this? I called my publicist this morning and told her to arrange a press conference for this afternoon, Ariel said, pulling out her phone to check the time. She thinks I've lost my mind, but she's professional enough to follow instructions even when she disagrees with them. We'll use the community center in Cedar Creek neutral ground that emphasizes this is about real people and authentic relationships rather than corporate strategy. Jack felt a moment of vertigo as he realized how quickly his quiet life was about to become public property, how the simple choices he'd been making as a father and business owner would soon be analyzed and debated by strangers who would reduce his complexity to whatever narrative served their entertainment needs. But underneath the anxiety was something else, sense of rightness about finally confronting the forces that had been trying to control their relationship from the outside, about refusing to let other people's agendas determine whether he and Ariel could build something meaningful together. We should talk to Max first, Jack said, his protective instincts engaging even as he committed to a course of action that would expose his son to unprecedented attention. He deserves to understand what we're planning and why. They found Max at Pete's house, working on a new science project, while Pete provided commentary and encouragement from his usual perch in the kitchen. The scene was so normal, so reminiscent of countless afternoons in Jack's own garage, that Jack felt a sharp pang of protective instinct about disrupting his son's peaceful routine. "Max, can we talk to you about something important?" Jack asked, settling into the chair beside his son while Ariel took the seat across from them. Max looked up from his projector model solar system that he was constructing with careful attention to relative sizes and distances, and immediately focused on the serious expressions of the adults around him. "Are you getting married?" he asked with the directness that had characterized his approach to their relationship from the beginning. "We're talking about it," Jack replied honestly, "but first we need to deal with some people who don't want us to be together." Max considered this information with the thoughtful expression he brought to complex problems. "Like the reporters outside your shop?" "Sort of," Ariel said, leaning forward to meet Max's eyes directly. "There's a woman who's angry at me because of some business decisions I made before I met you and your dad. She wants me to say that our friendship isn't real, that I was just pretending to care about you to make myself look better." "But that's not true," Max protested with the absolute moral clarity that 8-year-olds brought to questions of honesty and deception. "You really do care about us. I can tell." "I do care about you," Ariel confirmed, her voice warm with affection. "More than I've ever cared about anyone besides my family. But this woman thinks that if she tells newspapers and television stations bad things about me, it will prove that rich people don't deserve to be happy." Max processed this explanation with the same careful attention he brought to scientific concepts, working through the logic and implications with remarkable sophistication for someone his age. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "We're going to tell everyone the truth," Jack said, "about how we met, about why we care about each other, about the mistakes Ariel made in the past and how she's tried to fix them." "Will there be cameras?" Max asked, his excitement beginning to outweigh any anxiety about the attention. "Probably," Ariel admitted, "and reporters who will ask questions about our family and our relationship and what it means for the future." Max was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the pros and cons of public attention with the same methodical approach he brought to all important decisions. "Can I tell them about my volcano?" he asked finally. "And about the tide pools and Saturn's rings and how you knew all the answers to my questions?" The simple request delivered with such innocent enthusiasm, made both adults smile despite the gravity of their situation. Here was someone who saw the press conference not as a crisis to be managed, but as an opportunity to share the things that had made him happy. "You can tell them whatever you want," Jack assured him, "as long as you remember that some of the people asking questions might not be as nice as the people we usually talk to." "That's okay," Max said, with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered truly malicious intent. "I'm good at explaining things to people who don't understand them yet." 2 hours later, the Cedar Creek Community Center was packed with reporters, cameras, and curious residents who'd heard about the press conference through the small-town communication network that operated faster than any social media platform. Jack stood beside Ariel at a simple podium, with Max sitting in the front row next to Pete, his science fair trophy clutched in his hands like a talisman against adult complications. Ariel began by acknowledging the accusations that had been made against her, reading directly from the documents that Jennifer Chen had threatened to release. Her voice was steady as she detailed the acquisition decisions, the employee terminations, and her role in choices that had prioritized corporate efficiency over human welfare. "5 years ago, I made business decisions that destroyed lives," she said, looking directly into the cameras that would carry her words to millions of viewers. "I treated people like numbers on a spreadsheet rather than human beings, with families and dreams and financial obligations. One of those people, David Chen, took his own life rather than face the consequences of my choices." The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled reporters, who had clearly expected either denial or carefully crafted corporate speak, rather than such direct acknowledgement of responsibility. "I cannot undo those decisions," Ariel continued, "but I can tell you what I've learned from them and how they've changed the way I think about business and moral responsibility." She detailed the foundation she'd established, the comprehensive support systems she'd created for displaced workers, and the changes she'd implemented in Blake Technologies' acquisition practices. But more than that, she talked about the personal cost of living with decisions that had caused such suffering. "For 5 years, I've carried the weight of David Chen's death," she said, her voice beginning to carry emotion despite her obvious efforts to maintain composure. "I've wondered every day whether success built on other people's suffering can ever be justified. Whether someone like me deserves happiness when my choices contributed to such tragedy." Jack watched her struggle with these admissions, seeing the vulnerability beneath her public composure, the genuine remorse that had shaped her actions for half a decade. When she gestured for him to join her at the podium, he moved without hesitation. "Jack Nolan is not a publicity stunt," Ariel said as he settled beside her. "He's not a strategic decision or an image rehabilitation project. He's the first person in years who's treated me like a human being rather than a symbol, who's seen past my wealth and reputation to whatever decent qualities I might actually possess." Jack took the microphone, his hands slightly unsteady, as he faced the assembled crowd of strangers who would judge his next words and broadcast them to the world. "3 days ago, I didn't know who Ariel Blake was," he began, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. "I saw someone whose car had broken down, someone who needed help, and I stopped because that's what you do when your neighbors are in trouble." He talked about their roadside encounter, about Max's volcano demonstration, about the letter Ariel had written, and the genuine gratitude it had expressed. He described their weekend in Los Angeles, not as a romantic getaway, but as a chance for his son to experience wonder and discovery with someone who shared his enthusiasm for learning. "I've seen how she treats my 8-year-old son," Jack said, his voice carrying the conviction that came from direct observation rather than media speculation. "I've watched her kneel in the sand to examine tide pools with him, help him adjust a telescope to see Saturn's rings, listen to his questions about science and space and ocean life with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoys sharing knowledge." He paused, looking out at the crowd of reporters and residents, many of whom he'd known for years, people who'd watched him rebuild his life after Sarah's death, and who understood the weight of the decision he was making. "Ariel Blake made terrible business decisions 5 years ago," Jack continued. Decisions that caused real suffering and cost at least one man his life. But the woman I've come to know is someone who's spent every day since then trying to do better, trying to use her resources and influence to help rather than harm. A reporter called out a question about whether their relationship was genuine or calculated for publicity purposes. Jack felt Ariel tense beside him, but he answered without hesitation. When someone watches your child's science fair project with genuine delight, when they remember his interests well enough to write him a personal letter about shared discoveries, when they plan activities based entirely on what might make an 8-year-old happy that's not performance, Jack said, that's care. That's the kind of attention you give to people who matter to you. Max stood up from his seat in the front row, the science fair trophy still clutched in his hands, and approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had something important to say. "Can I talk?" he asked, looking between Jack and Ariel for permission. Jack lifted Max up so he could reach the microphone, his son's small presence at the podium immediately shifting the energy in the room from corporate crisis management to something more human and accessible. "Hi," Max said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'm Max, and Ariel is my friend." The simple introduction, delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence, seemed to disarm the assembled reporters, who had clearly not expected an 8-year-old to take charge of a press conference about corporate responsibility and romantic authenticity. "I want to tell you about my volcano," Max continued, launching into a detailed explanation of his science fair project and how Ariel had been the first adult besides his father to show genuine interest in the chemical reactions that created his papier-mâché eruption. As Max talked about tide pools and telescopes, about the ocean's vastness and Saturn's ancient rings, Jack felt something profound happening in the room. The complicated questions about corporate ethics and media manipulation were being overshadowed by a child's straightforward testimony about kindness and attention and shared wonder. "Ariel knows about everything," Max concluded, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "She answered all my questions, and she didn't talk to me like I was too little to understand important things. She's really smart and really nice, and I think people who say mean things about her just don't know her very well." The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, with questions about Ariel's business practices, their relationship timeline, and the foundation she'd established in David Chen's memory. But Max's simple testimony had fundamentally altered the narrative, transforming the story from one about corporate scandal and strategic romance to one about genuine human connection and the possibility of redemption through accountability and growth. As they left the community center, Jack felt both exhausted and oddly liberated. They had told their truth, exposed their vulnerabilities, and trusted that honesty might be more powerful than the strategic calculations that had governed so much of Ariel's professional life. "How do you think we did?" Ariel asked as they walked toward Pete's truck, Max skipping ahead of them with the boundless energy of someone who'd just had an exciting adventure. "I think we told the truth," Jack replied, "and I think Max reminded everyone what actually matters, not the mistakes people made in the past, but how they treat the people they care about in the present." That evening, as news coverage of their press conference began appearing on television and social media, Jack sat with Ariel and Max on Pete's front porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Cedar Creek. The reporters had finally dispersed, having gotten the story they came for, and the town was settling back into its normal rhythms. "Dad, are you going to marry Ariel now?" Max asked, the question delivered with the same casual directness he'd brought to the press conference. Jack looked at Ariel, seeing in her eyes the same hope and uncertainty he felt in his own chest. They had survived the public scrutiny, told their truth, and emerged with their connection intact. But the question of what came next remained open, dependent on their willingness to build something together despite all the complications that would always surround their different worlds. "Would you like that?" Jack asked his son. "I would," Max said simply. She makes you smile the way Mom used to, and she knows about science and space and ocean stuff, and she's really good at explaining things without making me feel stupid. It was exactly the kind of endorsement that mattered most, not from business partners or media commentators or strategic advisors, but from the 8-year-old boy whose happiness had been Jack's primary concern since Sarah's death. Jack reached for Ariel's hand, feeling the warmth of her touch and the possibility it represented. Tomorrow, they would face whatever consequences emerged from their decision to fight for their relationship, rather than surrender to the forces that wanted to control it. But tonight, sitting on a small-town porch with the two people who mattered most to him, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The simple certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the right people, building exactly the kind of life that honored both his past and his hopes for the future. 6 months later, on a crisp April morning, when the mountain air carried the promise of spring and new beginnings, Jack stood in his workshop behind the garage, carefully shaping 2 simple wedding bands from recycled gold. The metal had come from Sarah's jewelry box pieces she'd inherited from her grandmother and never worn, transformed now into symbols of a different kind of love, one that honored the past while embracing the future. The workshop itself had been transformed over the winter months, expanded with Ariel's financial support into a proper research and development facility where Jack could pursue the eco-friendly engine designs he'd abandoned after Sarah's death. The fusion of his mechanical expertise with Ariel's business acumen and environmental vision had created something neither could have achieved alone. A small company dedicated to sustainable automotive technology that employed 12 people and had already attracted interest from major manufacturers. Max burst through the workshop door with his usual enthusiasm, now 9 years old and even more curious about the world than he'd been during their first meeting with Ariel. "Dad, the caterers are here, and Ariel says to ask you if you want the flowers on the tables or just around the gazebo." Jack smiled at his son's excitement about the wedding preparations. Over the past 6 months, Max had appointed himself the unofficial coordinator of all celebration activities, approaching the planning with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to his science projects. "Both," Jack decided. "It's spring. We should have flowers everywhere." The wedding was taking place in Ariel's Los Angeles garden, but most of the guests would be from Cedar Creek Pete and the neighbors who'd become extended family, Max's teacher and classmates, the customers who'd become friends over years of reliable automotive service. Ariel had insisted on keeping the celebration small and personal, focused on the community that had embraced her despite the media scrutiny that had followed their relationship. The press coverage of their confrontation with Chen had ultimately worked in their favor, transforming public perception from skepticism about their relationship to admiration for their courage in facing their critics honestly. Ariel's acknowledgement of her role in Chen's death, combined with evidence of the foundation she'd established and the changes she'd implemented in her business practices, had created a narrative about accountability and growth that resonated with people tired of corporate evasion and strategic damage control. Chen herself had eventually agreed to meet with Ariel, not to forgive, but to establish the David Chen Institute for Ethical Business Practices, a research center funded by Blake Technologies but operated independently, dedicated to developing corporate policies that prioritized human welfare alongside profit maximization. It wasn't the complete victory Jennifer had initially demanded, but it was meaningful progress toward the systemic changes she wanted to see. "Dad, are you nervous?" Max asked, settling onto a stool to watch Jack work on the wedding rings. "A little," Jack admitted, "but the good kind of nervous, like when you're about to try something new that might be wonderful. Like when we first went to see the ocean." Exactly like that. The ocean had become a regular part of their lives over the past 6 months, with monthly trips to Los Angeles that allowed Max to maintain his friendship with Ariel while giving Jack time to work on collaborative projects between his small company and Blake Technologies. They'd found a rhythm that honored both Jack's desire to raise Max in Cedar Creek's stable community and Ariel's need to maintain her business responsibilities in Los Angeles. The solution had been elegant in its simplicity. Ariel had purchased a small house in Cedar Creek, not far from Jack's garage, where she could spend half her time while conducting much of her business remotely. The arrangement gave them the benefit of proximity without requiring either to abandon the life they'd built, and it allowed Max to grow up with consistent access to both his father's grounded stability and Ariel's ambitious vision of what was possible. "When you're married to Ariel, will she be my mom?" Max asked. The question delivered with the casual directness that had characterized his approach to their evolving family structure from the beginning. Jack paused in his work, considering how to answer a question that touched on complex emotional territory. "She'll be your stepmother," he said carefully, "which means she'll love you and help take care of you like a mom would. But it doesn't change the fact that your first mom will always be special and important." "Can I have two moms?" Max asked. "One who's with the angels and one who's here with us." The simple wisdom of his son's question made Jack's chest tight with love and gratitude. "I think that would be perfect." Max nodded solemnly, filing this information away with all the other important facts about family and love and the way relationships could grow and change without diminishing what had come before. "Ariel says after the wedding we're going to Yellowstone to see the geysers," Max said, his excitement building as he contemplated their honeymoon adventure. "She says Old Faithful erupts every 90 minutes, just like clockwork, because of underground pressure and superheated water." Jack smiled at Ariel's ability to turn even their honeymoon into an educational opportunity for Max. She'd become remarkably skilled at finding the scientific principles underlying everyday experiences, encouraging Max's curiosity, while also feeding her own desire to understand how things worked. "That sounds like the perfect trip for our family," Jack said, meaning it completely. The word family felt natural now in a way it hadn't 6 months earlier, when Jack had still been uncertain about whether he could open his heart to someone new without betraying his memories of Sarah. But Ariel had never asked him to choose between his past and his future instead. She'd helped him understand that love could expand rather than replace, that honoring Sarah's memory meant continuing to build the kind of life she would have wanted for him and Max. Pete appeared in the workshop doorway, dressed in his best suit and carrying a thermos that probably contained something stronger than coffee. "Son, I think it's time you stopped fiddling with those rings and started getting yourself ready for the most important day of your life." Jack looked down at the wedding bands he'd been crafting, simple circles of gold that would symbolize the promise he and Ariel were making to build a life together, despite all the challenges that might arise. They weren't perfect, showed the honest marks of handwork rather than machine precision, but they were made with love and intention, which seemed more important than technical perfection. "What do you think, Pete?" Jack asked, holding up the rings for inspection. Pete examined them with the careful attention he brought to all important matters. "I think Sarah would be proud of the man you've become and the woman you've chosen to share Max's future with." The blessing meant more to Jack than any formal ceremony could, coming from someone who'd known Sarah and understood the weight of the choice Jack was making. Pete had become more than a friend over the years. Since Sarah's death, he'd been a surrogate grandfather to Max and a source of steady wisdom for Jack during the most difficult period of his life. 2 hours later, Jack stood in Ariel's garden, surrounded by everyone who mattered most, watching his son present the rings with the serious dignity of someone who understood the importance of the moment. Max had insisted on being the ring-bearer, approaching the responsibility with the same methodical preparation he brought to all challenging tasks. Ariel looked beautiful in a simple dress that she'd chosen because Max had said it was the color of the ocean on their first trip to the beach together. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore the kind of genuine smile that Jack had rarely seen in her corporate photographs, the expression of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the right people. The ceremony itself was brief and personal, focused on the promises they were making to each other and to Max, rather than the formal requirements that would make their union legally binding. Jack spoke about choosing love over fear, about building a life that honored both individual dreams and shared commitments. Ariel talked about finding family in unexpected places, about the courage required to remain open to connection despite past disappointments and future uncertainties. When they exchanged the rings Jack had made, he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since Sarah's death, not the end of grief, which would always be part of him, but the beginning of a new chapter that could coexist with beautiful memories while creating space for different kinds of happiness. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced, and Jack did, feeling Ariel's smile against his lips and hearing Max's enthusiastic cheering from somewhere behind them. The reception was exactly what they'd wanted, a celebration that felt like an extended family gathering rather than a formal event. Pete regaled the Los Angeles guests with stories about Jack's mechanical genius and Max's scientific precocity. Max demonstrated his latest volcano experiment for anyone who would watch. Ariel's business partners, who had initially viewed Jack with skepticism, found themselves drawn into conversations about small-town life and the value of community-based relationships. As the sun set over the mountains visible from Ariel's garden, Jack found himself dancing with his new wife, while Max attempted to teach other children the proper technique for examining tide pools. The scene felt perfect in its imperfection: too much food, slightly chaotic music, conversations that ranged from quantum physics to engine repair to the best methods for growing tomatoes in mountain soil. "Are you happy?" Ariel asked, as they swayed together to music that Max had chosen because it reminded him of ocean waves. "I'm happy," Jack confirmed, meaning it more completely than he'd thought possible 6 months earlier. "Are you?" "I'm happier than I've ever been," Ariel replied. "And not because of the wedding or the celebration, but because I get to wake up tomorrow knowing that I'm part of a real family, that Max will always have someone who loves him unconditionally, that we're building something together that's bigger than any individual achievement." They danced in comfortable silence for a while, watching their guests enjoy the evening and each other, seeing their different worlds blend together in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Jack's Cedar Creek friends were sharing gardening advice with Ariel's Los Angeles colleagues. Max was explaining the principles of volcanic eruption to a group of adults who were genuinely interested in his scientific expertise. "What happens next?" Jack asked. Not because he was worried about the future, but because he was curious about how they would continue building their unconventional family structure. "Next, we go to Yellowstone and watch geysers with our son," Ariel said, the possessive pronoun carrying all the love and commitment she felt toward Max. "Then we come home to both our homesand, keep building something that honors where we've each come from while creating space for whatever we might become together." As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, Jack found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A broken-down car on a dusty road, an 8-year-old's volcano demonstration, a vulnerable letter that had revealed the loneliness beneath success and wealth. None of it had been planned or calculated, but all of it had been necessary for them to find each other. Max fell asleep in the car on the drive back to the hotel where they would spend their wedding night before leaving for Yellowstone the next morning. Jack carried his son up to their room, tucking him into bed, while Ariel changed out of her wedding dress into comfortable clothes that would be better suited for their family adventure. "Thank you," Ariel said as they settled into bed themselves, Max sleeping peacefully in the adjoining room. "For what?" Jack asked. "For taking the risk," she replied. "For believing that someone like me could learn to be part of a family like yours. For trusting that love could be stronger than all the complications that seemed determined to keep us apart." Jack pulled her closer, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his and the quiet contentment that came from knowing they had built something real together, despite all the obstacles they'd faced. "Thank you for fighting for us," he replied. "For refusing to let other people's agendas determine what we could mean to each other. For showing Max that the world is full of possibilities he hasn't even imagined yet." Outside their window, Los Angeles hummed with its constant energy, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles, while Jack and Ariel and Max began their new life together. But inside their room, everything was peaceful and certain, grounded in the kind of love that grew slowly through shared experiences and mutual respect, and the daily choice to remain committed to each other's happiness. In the morning, they would drive north toward Yellowstone, toward geysers and hot springs, and the kind of natural wonders that would feed Max's curiosity and give them new discoveries to share. They would return to their dual homes in Cedar Creek and Los Angeles, to the business they were building together and the community that had embraced their unconventional family structure. But tonight, they were simply three people who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen love over fear and connection over isolation, who had proved that the best things in life really were worth fighting for, even when they seemed impossible. Especially when they seemed impossible. As Jack drifted off to sleep beside his new wife, with his son breathing peacefully in the next room, he felt Sarah's presence, not as a weight from the past, but as a blessing on the future. Her love transformed into the wisdom and courage that had allowed him to remain open to new possibilities. Her memory preserved in the values he was passing on to Max and the kind of family they were building together. The vintage Ferrari that had started it all sat in Ariel's garage, now fully restored and running perfectly, ready for weekend drives through the mountains with a family that had learned to appreciate both the journey and the destination. It remained a symbol of connection, not just between father and daughter, but between past and future, between the different worlds that love could bridge when people were brave enough to meet each other halfway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and adventures, but tonight there was only gratitude for the broken-down car that had brought them together, the 8-year-old's volcano that had shown them what really mattered, and the courage they'd found to fight for something that felt worth preserving. In a world full of strategic calculations and careful positioning, they had chosen authenticity and discovered that the most valuable things in life were still the ones that couldn't be bought or negotiated or strategically acquired. They had to be freely given and gratefully received, one genuine moment at a time.